She had $1 billion in her bank account and couldn't tell a single person the truth about her life. He had nothing left but a daughter who needed him and an apartment that smelled like old rain. One desperate lie, one weekend, two strangers who should have walked away the moment it was over. But here's the thing about lies, the good ones start feeling like something else entirely. This is the story of a billionaire who hid from her own life, and the quiet man who accidentally gave her a reason to stop running. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The first thing Logan Hayes noticed about his new roommate was that she paid 3 months of rent in cash. Not a check. Not a wire transfer. Not Venmo with a little house emoji. Cash. Neat banded stacks of $100 bills that she slid across the kitchen table without blinking, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Logan had stared at the money for a long moment. Then he'd looked at the woman sitting across from him. Plain gray hoodie, no makeup, hair pulled back so severely it almost looked like a punishment. And he'd thought, drug dealer or heiress? He hadn't asked. He needed the rent money too badly to ask. That had been 4 months ago. Now it was November in Seattle, and the rain had settled in for what felt like the rest of human history. And Logan was standing at the kitchen sink at 6:47 in the morning, watching the street below drown in gray water, trying to remember if he'd signed Mia's field trip permission slip or if he'd only thought about signing it, which was a completely different thing. Papa. He turned. His daughter stood in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the little foxes on them that she'd had since she was 4, and absolutely refused to give up, even though she was now 7, and the foxes were faded into barely recognizable smudges. Her hair was a spectacular disaster. She was holding her backpack in one hand and a permission slip in the other. "You forgot," she said. She wasn't accusatory about it. She just stated it the way she stated most things, like a small scientist recording an observation. "I didn't forget," Logan said. "I was about to." "That's the same as forgetting." "It's really not." Mia set the permission slip on the counter beside him and climbed onto the bar stool, watching him root through the junk drawer for a pen. The junk drawer was a catastrophe. Broken rubber bands, expired coupons, a birthday candle shaped like a number 3 that had no business still existing, 3 pens that definitely didn't work, and 1 pen that might. Logan found it at the back, tested it against his palm, and signed the permission slip with the focused determination of a man who had exactly 11 minutes before the school bus arrived. "Is Vivian awake?" Mia asked. "Probably not. She said she'd make me eggs on Thursday. It's Tuesday." Mia considered this. She might have forgotten what day it is. People who work from home sometimes do. This was the entirety of what Logan had told his daughter about their roommate. She works from home and sometimes forgets what day it is. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It also wasn't anywhere close to the full truth. But Mia was 7, and 7-year-olds didn't need to understand the complicated economics of why a grown woman would choose to live in a 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill when she could presumably afford to live anywhere else on the planet. Logan finished the permission slip, tucked it in the front pocket of Mia's backpack, zipped it closed, and pressed a kiss to the top of her chaotic hair. "Boots," he said. "Hat. Let's go." He dropped Mia at the bus stop 7 minutes later, standing in the rain with his hood up while she chatted at him about a book she was reading about volcanoes. He made the appropriate sounds of interest while his brain was already somewhere else, specifically in the Meridian Tower project files that were currently spread across his drafting table like a crime scene investigation, full of structural calculations that didn't quite add up in ways that made him wake up at 3 a.m. with his pulse too fast. He was a structural engineer. He found the hidden weaknesses in things and figured out how to compensate for them before they failed. It was quiet work, methodical. Most people didn't fully understand what he did, which suited him fine. He'd spent enough years trying to make himself interesting to someone who found him ordinary. He didn't do that anymore. The bus came. Mia got on. She didn't wave. She wasn't in a waving phase, but she found a window seat and pressed her palm against the glass for a moment before the bus pulled away, which Logan privately thought was better than a wave anyway. He stood there until the bus turned the corner. Then he walked home in the rain. Vivian Sterling was already awake. She was sitting at the small desk in her room with her laptop open and 3 windows running simultaneously. A spreadsheet that tracked advertising revenue for Meridian Magazine's digital properties, a draft of an editorial letter she'd been rewriting for 2 weeks, and her email, which she kept minimized because looking at it too long made her feel like she was being slowly submerged in cold water. She'd been awake since 4. This was normal for her. Sleep had always been something she was bad at. Her brain refused to stop working when the lights went out, and she'd spent most of her adult life either surrendering to that fact or fighting it and losing. These days, she surrendered. It was easier. She heard the front door open and close, heard Logan's boots hit the floor. He always took them off immediately, which she respected. Heard the familiar sounds of him moving through the kitchen. She heard the coffee maker start, then quiet. She saved her spreadsheet, closed her email without looking at it, and put on a clean sweatshirt before going out. Logan was at the kitchen table with a mug and a folder of papers, his reading glasses on, making small marks on a printed diagram with a red pen. He looked up when she came in. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "Thanks." She poured herself a mug and leaned against the counter. This was usually how their mornings went. She'd come out, he'd already have coffee ready without making any pointed thing about it, and they'd exist in the same room without demanding anything from each other. She'd had roommates in college who needed to perform the experience of mourning together. Aggressive cheerfulness, mandatory check-ins, the constant social maintenance of cohabitation. Logan didn't do any of that. He was simply there, or he wasn't, and he seemed to understand instinctively that some people needed their first 20 minutes of the day to just be quiet. She had been intensely grateful for this approximately every single morning for 4 months. "How's the project going?" she asked, nodding at his papers. "Poorly." He didn't say it with drama, just straightforward. "There's a load distribution issue on the west elevation that's been driving me crazy for 3 days. I keep thinking I'm close, and then the numbers slide out from under me." "What does that mean in practice?" "If you don't fix it." He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "In practice, it means I tell the contractor we need to redesign part of the support system, which costs time and money and a certain amount of professional credibility because I signed off on the original design, and now I'm saying it's wrong." "That must be uncomfortable." "Yeah." "But you're doing it anyway." "I mean, obviously." He said it like there was no alternative, like telling the truth about a structural problem was simply what you did because the alternative was a building that might eventually fall down and hurt people. No moral anguish, just the logical conclusion. Vivian wrapped both hands around her mug and thought about what it would feel like to operate that way in her own life. To simply tell the truth because the alternative caused harm. To not spend 3 months carefully managing the distance between what people believed about her and what was actually real. She'd gotten very good at managed distances. She'd moved to Seattle from New York 11 months ago, when the pressure had gotten bad enough that she'd started doing things that scared her. Not dangerous things. She wasn't in a crisis exactly. But she'd find herself sitting at her desk in the Meridian offices on the 42nd floor of a midtown building, looking at her calendar for the week. 7 networking events, 2 benefit galas, 1 board meeting, 1 session with her mother's preferred therapist who mainly functioned as a family intelligence gatherer. And she'd feel her chest close like a fist. The Meridian was hers, in the way that a legacy you're handed at birth is yours. Technically, undeniably, but also in a way that has nothing to do with what you actually chose. Her parents had started it. Her mother had edited it for 20 years. Then Vivian had taken it over at 26, the youngest editor-in-chief in the magazine's history, which the press had made a whole thing about. Brilliant, poised, the future of luxury publishing. Every profile written about her used the same cluster of adjectives, and all of them were about the surface, and none of them got anywhere near the actual person inside the surface. And after a while, Vivian had stopped being able to find that person herself. So she'd run, not dramatically. She hadn't disappeared. She still ran the magazine, still answered emails, still made decisions. She'd told her parents she needed a change of scenery for her mental health, which was true, in the way that "I need water" is true when you've been walking in a desert for 3 days. She'd found an apartment in a city where nobody knew her face, signed the lease under her real name because she'd been too tired to be clever about it, and shown up at the door with 2 suitcases and the profound relief of someone who has just taken off a costume they've been wearing for years. She'd paid the first 3 months in cash because she didn't want any digital trail for her parents to find. Logan had stared at the money and not asked a single question. She had known, at that moment, that she'd chosen the right apartment. They'd learned each other's rhythms the way neighbors learn each other's schedules. not through conversation, but through observation and accumulation. She knew that Logan woke up at 6:15 every day, made coffee before anything else, and was always at his drafting table by 7. She knew that he ordered Thai food on Fridays and that he tipped exactly 25%, which she'd deduced from overhearing a phone call. She knew he called his mother on Sunday evenings and that those conversations lasted exactly as long as they needed to and never seemed to be painful in the way that some family calls were painful. She knew he read actual physical books, not an e-reader, physical books, and left them face down on the coffee table with the spines cracking, which she privately found both charming and maddening. He knew that she worked strange hours and ate irregularly, and sometimes forgot that meals were supposed to happen at intervals. He knew she ran at 5 a.m. in any weather, including the weather Seattle specialized in, which was the kind of cold rain that didn't fall so much as materialize out of the air itself. He knew she'd taken 3 calls in French and 2 in what he suspected was Mandarin, both of which he'd never mentioned. He knew she sometimes stood in the kitchen late at night and just stood there, not doing anything, the way people stand when their brain has temporarily run out of room for one more thing. He'd never asked about any of it. That restraint, that particular deliberate restraint, was something Vivian thought about more than she probably should. The week everything changed started on a Wednesday. She'd been on a call with her head of digital operations, a tense, circular conversation about Q4 projections that she'd been having versions of for 3 months, when her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. She'd ignored it. It buzzed again. Then again. Then a 4th time that she recognized, from bitter experience, as the frequency of a woman who had decided her daughter was ignoring her and was choosing to interpret this as an emergency. She ended the call, looked at the texts, and felt her stomach drop. "We're coming to Seattle. Your father has a meeting there Friday. We've rearranged to come early. We'll arrive Thursday evening, and we very much want to finally meet this person you've been seeing. Vivian, please respond." She set the phone down on the desk and stared at the wall. The person she'd been seeing. 8 weeks ago, in a moment of profound tactical error, she had told her mother she was in a relationship. She'd done it because her mother had been pushing, not gently, not occasionally, but with the sustained, focused pressure of someone who considered their child's single status a problem requiring a solution. And that particular week, Vivian had been exhausted and depleted, and she'd said, "Yes, fine, I'm seeing someone," just to make the conversation stop. Her mother had immediately wanted details. Vivian had provided the minimum survivable number. His name was Logan. He was an engineer. He was good with his daughter. Her mother had gone quiet in a way that suggested either approval or strategic repositioning, and then the subject had shifted, and Vivian had thought, foolishly, stupidly, with the magical thinking of someone who wants a problem to be over, that it might simply fade away. Instead, her parents were arriving Thursday to meet Logan, who had no idea any of this was happening. She sat in her room for a long time. She heard Mia come home from school. She could identify Mia's particular way of opening the front door, which involved more enthusiasm than was structurally advisable, and heard her and Logan in the kitchen doing homework, their voices a low, steady murmur that she'd grown so accustomed to that she sometimes didn't realize it was there until it stopped. She stayed in her room until she heard Mia go to bed. Then she sat for another 30 minutes. Then she went to the kitchen. Logan was at the table with a different folder, this one thicker, his glasses still on. He'd made tea at some point. There was a mug near his elbow. The overhead light was off, and he was working under the smaller light above the stove, which threw the kitchen into a particular amber quality that made everything look like a photograph from a long time ago. He looked up when she came in. She'd spent the 30 minutes in her room rehearsing how to begin this conversation. She'd run through 6 different opening lines. All of them sounded, in her head, either manipulative or insane. "I did something stupid," she said. He took his glasses off, set them on the table, gave her his attention in the complete, unhurried way he gave things his attention when he decided they required it. "Okay," he said. She sat down across from him. The rain was hitting the window above the sink hard. She could smell his tea, something with ginger. "My parents are coming Thursday. They land in the evening. They think—" She stopped, reorganized. "I told my mother 2 months ago that I was in a relationship. I told her your name. I told her you were an engineer and that you had a daughter and that things were serious." Silence. I told her that because she was pushing and I was tired and I thought it would stop the conversation, Vivian continued. I did not expect her to use a business trip as an excuse to come and meet you in person. Logan looked at her. His expression was attentive but unreadable. He had a face that didn't telegraph everything he was thinking, which she'd found unsettling at first and had gradually come to appreciate. When you say my name, he said slowly, you mean the Logan who lives in this apartment? Yes. As in me? Yes. He was quiet for a moment, then, did you tell them anything else about me? Or just the engineer, the kid? She hesitated. I may have mentioned that you're kind. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatically. He wasn't the kind of person things shifted dramatically across. Just a small internal adjustment, like a measurement that had come in slightly differently than expected. I need to ask you something, she said, and I need you to know that if you say no, I completely understand, and I will figure something else out, and it won't affect the apartment or any of the arrangement we have here. What are you asking? She looked at the table, then back up at him. There was something fundamentally humiliating about this, and she was not a person accustomed to feeling humiliated, and the feeling sat heavily in her chest alongside the fear. I'm asking if you'll pretend to be my boyfriend for one weekend. The rain kept hitting the window. Logan didn't say anything for long enough that she started calculating escape routes. Then he picked up his pen, tapped it twice against the folder, and said, What time do they land Thursday? She blinked. What? Your parents. What time Thursday? 6:45. Are they coming here straight from the airport? Probably. My mother will want to see the apartment. He nodded, like this was a project he was taking on. Like she'd come to him with a structural problem, and he was beginning to map the load points. He opened the folder to a blank page at the back and looked at her. Start from the beginning, he said. Tell me everything I'm supposed to know about us. They stayed at that kitchen table until 1 in the morning. Logan had a list of questions, and he asked them in the methodical, systematic way he apparently did everything, and Vivian found herself answering with a truthfulness she hadn't planned on. He wanted the shape of the lie to make sense, and in order for it to make sense, she had to fill it with things that were real. How long had they been together? She told her mother they met when she first moved to Seattle, so 11 months in theory. Not long, but it had felt fast. Logan had noted this. Fast but serious. He'd written that down. How had they met? She'd told her mother through a mutual connection, vague enough to be unfalsifiable. Logan had suggested they give it slightly more texture. They'd been at the same coffee shop. Vivian had asked a question about the structural drawings spread across his table. She'd always been curious about architecture, she'd told her mother, and it had gone from there. Logan had added this to the list without commenting on the fact that it was a story about two people meeting by accident when they already lived together. What did her parents know about his history? She'd mentioned that he'd been through a difficult breakup, that he had a daughter, that he'd rebuilt his life from something hard. She'd told them this almost inadvertently during the same conversation, and she'd included it, she realized now, because she'd believed it. Even then, before she'd thought of any of this as something that needed to be performed, she had been speaking about him with the particularity of someone who'd actually been paying attention. Logan had paused when she told him that. You talked about me to your parents before you had a reason to, he'd said. Yes. I don't know why. He'd written something down that she couldn't read from across the table. They'd gone through questions his daughter might ask, questions the dinner conversation might veer into, the specific way he should be with her in her parents' presence. Not performatively affectionate, she'd said, because her father would find that suspicious. Natural. Easy. Like people who'd had enough time to stop needing to prove themselves to each other. Can I be honest with you? Logan asked at one point. Obviously. Your parents don't sound like people who are going to be fooled by effort, he said. The more we try to perform this, the more it's going to look like a performance. So I think we should just talk to them the way we actually talk. Answer questions honestly. Not try to construct something. Just exist the way we already exist. Vivian had looked at him across the table. The light was still that amber color. There was a pen mark on his wrist from where he'd been taking notes. He had a habit, she'd noticed months ago, of looking like he was thinking about two things simultaneously without letting either one go. You're very calm about this, she said. It's one weekend. My father has dismantled men with more preparation than you have. For what specific purpose would he do that? She considered this. To see what they're made of. Logan picked up his pen again. Then I don't think preparation is the right response to that. I think being made of something real is. She'd stared at him for a moment, and she'd felt something that she didn't immediately have a word for. Something like relief, but not the relief of a problem being solved. Relief at having told the truth to someone and had them not flinch. "What about Mia?" she asked. He hadn't hesitated. "I won't tell her it's a pretend relationship. I don't lie to my daughter, but she already thinks of you as someone in her life. That's not fake. She doesn't need to know anything more than that." "I'm sorry," Vivian said, "for making her part of this." "You didn't make her part of it. She made herself part of it months ago." A pause. "You let her, which I noticed." Vivian wrapped her hands around her mug. The tea had gone cold. "She's easy to let in." "Yeah." His voice had something in it that she didn't examine too closely. "She is." Thursday came the way things come in November in Seattle. Quietly, with gray light that never quite brightened, the city going about its business under a sky the color of old concrete. Logan had gone to work. Vivian had worked from her room, or tried to. She'd rewritten the same editorial paragraph 4 times and eventually given up and stared at her phone for a while, then put her phone face down and stared at the ceiling. At 3 in the afternoon, she went to the kitchen and found that Logan had left a note on the counter. Not a long note. He wasn't a long note person. Just, "Mia has a play date until 7. I'll be home by 5. Don't worry about dinner. I've got it." She stood there holding the small piece of paper. He'd remembered. In the middle of a workday, with his load distribution problem and his Meridian Tower files, he'd remembered that she would be alone in this apartment running through worst-case scenarios, and he'd left a note to tell her the logistics so she didn't have to manage them herself, and he'd told her he'd handle dinner so she had one less thing to carry. It was such a small thing. She folded the note and put it in the pocket of her sweatshirt, and that was when she should have been more careful. That was the moment, if she'd been paying proper attention to herself, when she should have recognized what was starting to happen. But she didn't. Or she did, and she ignored it, which amounted to the same thing. Logan came home at 4:50, which was either very Logan or a deliberate 10 minutes early. He came in with 2 paper bags from the Italian place 3 blocks over that they'd discovered by accident on a Wednesday 2 months ago when they'd both run out of groceries simultaneously. He set the bags on the counter and started unpacking without ceremony. "What time do they land?" he asked. 45 minutes? They'll be here by 8, maybe 8:30. That's enough time to eat." He was pulling out containers, and the smell of garlic and rosemary and something with lemon filled the apartment in a way that was almost aggressively comforting. "Go change if you want to, or don't. You look fine." "I look like I've been anxious for 6 hours." "You look like a person who lives in this apartment," he said simply, which is accurate. She went and changed anyway. Not into anything performative, not into her Vivian Sterling editor-in-chief clothes, which she'd kept at the back of her closet like theatrical costumes she no longer had a use for. She put on dark jeans and a dark blue sweater that she'd had for years, the one with the small fraying on the left cuff that she'd meant to repair since the spring. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and thought, "This is what I actually look like. This is the person behind the other person." She thought about what Logan had said the night before, being made of something real. When she came back to the kitchen, Mia was home. She'd arrived while Vivian was changing, and she was already at the counter telling Logan about a disagreement at the playdate with a level of narrative detail that would have impressed a court reporter. She saw Vivian come in and immediately shifted tracks. "Your parents are coming tonight," she said. Not a question. She'd clearly already gotten this information from Logan. "They are," Vivian said. "Are they nice?" They're, Vivian considered. "They're very much themselves." Mia processed this. "Papa is very much himself, and he's nice." "That's true." "So maybe they're nice too." Logan was putting food onto plates, and Vivian caught his expression at this. Just briefly, just a fraction of a smile that he aimed at the stovetop rather than at anyone in particular. She noticed it. She was starting to notice everything, which should have been more of a warning than it felt. They'd eaten dinner and cleaned up and put Mia to bed, or Mia had been put to bed and then gotten up for water, then been put to bed again, then had a question about volcanoes that apparently couldn't wait, and then finally settled, by the time the text arrived from her mother. In the elevator, coming up, Logan was on the couch with one of his face-down books. He'd changed after dinner into a clean dark shirt and dark pants, and he'd done it without making any production of it, which meant he was either genuinely unconcerned or so far inside his own calm that the difference between concern and composure had disappeared. Vivian stood in the middle of the living room. "They're coming up," she said. He set the book down, stood, looked at her. Vivian. Something about him just saying her name in that way, not reassuringly, not making a speech, made her exhale. "Yeah," she said. "You lived here first," he said. "This is your home. They're visitors to it." She hadn't thought about it that way. The knock at the door came before she could say anything else. Charles Sterling was a tall man in his mid-60s who had the particular bearing of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms where everything was negotiable and had learned to carry himself as if he were the one constant. He wore a charcoal coat. He had silver hair and Vivian's exact eyes, that specific dark gray that looked almost green in certain lights. And he stood in the doorway of his daughter's apartment and did not smile, exactly, but looked. Eleanor Sterling, Vivian's mother, was a different architecture entirely. Small, elegant, in a cream coat that cost more than Logan's monthly rent. She moved into the apartment with the self-possession of someone who believed rooms arranged themselves around her presence. She kissed Vivian on both cheeks, held her by the shoulders, looked at her with the trained scrutiny of a woman who had been assessing people for 50 years. "You look well," she said. "Thinner." "I'm fine, Mom." "You look well," she repeated, which was confirmation more than repetition. Then both of them looked at Logan. Logan was standing near the kitchen, hands easy at his sides. He didn't come forward immediately, not in a standoffish way, just in the way of someone who understands that two people who've just walked through a door deserve a moment to orient themselves before a stranger crosses into their space. He'd done this with Vivian the day she moved in, she realized now. The same small patience. "Mr. Sterling, Mrs. Sterling," he said. He stepped forward then and extended his hand to Charles first. "I'm Logan. It's good to meet you both." Charles took the hand and shook it. He looked at Logan the way he probably looked at everything, assessing load-bearing capacity. "Engineer," he said. "Structural," Logan said. "That's specific." The specifics matter in that field. Charles made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but contained something adjacent to approval, and Vivian felt, almost against her will, a wave of something very close to gratitude. What? Eleanor wanted tea. Logan made it. Charles stood in the living room looking at the apartment with the expression of a man who was making calculations, and Vivian stood near him, feeling the particular stress of watching someone she loved. And she did love her father, she reminded herself, underneath all the complicated architecture of what love in her family looked like, render judgment on her life. "It's smaller than I expected," Charles said. "It's enough space," Vivian said. "For 3 people? We manage." Charles turned to look at her directly. He had a way of looking at her that she'd been trying to decode her entire life, some combination of affection and expectation and an ancient grief she'd never fully understood the source of. "You seem different," he said. "Different how?" "Less," he paused, searching. "Less defended." She didn't have an answer for that. Fortunately, Logan came back with the tea things, and Eleanor materialized from where she'd been examining the bookshelf, and they all settled into the living room, and the real evening began. The thing about her father's questions was that they didn't feel like interrogation while they were happening. Charles Sterling asked things conversationally, in the natural flow of whatever topic was on the table, and it was only afterward that you'd realize you'd been methodically mapped. He asked Logan about the Meridian Tower, the project, not the magazine. Logan explained it clearly and without embellishment, including the current problem with the load distribution on the west elevation, and Charles had leaned forward slightly at this. "You're telling me about a failure," he said. "I'm telling you about a problem I'm working to correct," Logan said. "Telling you about it honestly is relevant to understanding what I do. Most people in your position would have downplayed it. Most people in my position don't want a building to fall down." Charles looked at him for a moment. Then, "Fair enough?" Eleanor asked about Mia. Carefully, the way she'd been briefed to, Vivian suspected. meaning she'd already researched everything she could find and was asking questions to see if the answers matched. Logan talked about his daughter with the natural, unperformative love of someone who didn't need to convince anyone of anything. He didn't make it a presentation. He said she was obsessed with volcanoes right now and had opinions about bread that were surprisingly strong for a 7-year-old. And he'd said it so simply that Eleanor had actually laughed. A real laugh, not a social one. The evening moved. The tea went. A bottle of wine appeared that Charles had brought, and they moved from the living room to the kitchen table, which was where Vivian's family always ended up, which she realized she had unconsciously clocked as significant. And then her father asked the question. He asked it without preamble, setting his wine glass down and looking across the table at Logan with the directness of a man who had decided the evening had been long enough to earn it. "How serious are you about my daughter?" The kitchen went quiet. Vivian felt her whole body brace. Logan didn't rush to answer. He didn't look at Vivian first. He looked at her father, holding the question for a moment, and then he looked at Vivian, and there was something in the way he looked at her that she hadn't seen before, or hadn't let herself see. "When I'm with her," Logan said, "I don't feel like I have to become someone else." The table was very still. Vivian's mother set her glass down very carefully. Vivian was looking at Logan, and he was looking at her, and he wasn't performing it. That was the thing she couldn't get past. That was what made the ground feel like it was tilting under her in a way that had nothing to do with lies. He wasn't performing it. It was landing in his face the same way things landed in his face when they were real. Her father said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That's not the answer I was expecting." "I know," Logan said. "It's a better one." Her mother, across the table, was looking at Vivian with an expression that Vivian had seen exactly once before. When Vivian was 22 and had brought home the thesis she'd written that had nothing to do with the magazine and everything to do with what she actually loved. Her mother had looked at her that way then, like she was seeing something arrive that she'd been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. Under the table, without looking at anyone, Vivian pressed her palm flat against her own thigh to stop her hand from shaking. She made it through the rest of the evening on some combination of adrenaline and the particular competence she'd spent 30 years developing. The ability to function in high-stakes rooms, even when she was coming apart at a frequency nobody else could hear. Her parents left at 11. Her father shook Logan's hand in the doorway and said, "Next time we're here, I want to hear more about that tower." And Logan had said, "It should be worth telling by then." And the two of them had a moment that Vivian recognized as men who had decided they respected each other, which was both everything and completely beside the point. Her mother hugged her at the door, held her longer than usual. "He looks at you," she whispered, "the way I was never sure anyone was going to." Vivian pulled back, looked at her mother. "Mom, I know," Eleanor said, touched her cheek. "I know." The door closed. Vivian stood in the empty hallway of her own apartment, and from the kitchen she could hear Logan already doing something, running water, putting glasses away, occupying himself with the small physical tasks that followed the ending of hard evenings. She stood there for a moment. She thought, this was supposed to be a lie. She thought, I don't know when it stopped feeling like one. And then she went to help with the dishes. And she didn't say anything, and neither did he. And the rain came back against the windows like it had never left. The dishes were done by midnight. They hadn't talked much while doing them. Logan washed, Vivian dried, and they'd fallen into the rhythm of it the way they fell into most things in this apartment, which was, without discussion or negotiation, just two people occupying the same space and working around each other with the kind of ease that usually took years to develop. She'd thought about that, standing at the sink with a dish towel, the rain steady against the window, the apartment quiet in the specific way it got after Mia was asleep, and the evening had finally released them. Her parents had liked him. Not performed like. Not the polite tolerance they extended to people they'd already decided weren't worth the full attention. Her father had liked him, which was, she was still processing what that meant, standing here in her own kitchen at midnight, drying a wine glass that Logan handed her without looking. You didn't have to do that, she said finally. Explain the tower problem. You could have just given him the clean version. He'd have known it was clean. Probably. Definitely. Logan pulled the stopper from the sink. Your father is a man who spent 40 years identifying what's missing from presentations. You don't give a person like that a presentation. She thought about what her mother had whispered at the door and felt something tighten in her chest. She put it away. She was good at putting things away. Thank you, she said. For tonight. For all of it. Logan dried his hands on the dish towel she passed back. He looked at her with that particular expression of his. Not warm exactly. Not cool, just present. Just fully there in a way most people weren't. You did fine, he said. You were yourself. I wasn't, though. That's the thing. The whole evening was what? He folded the towel over the oven handle the way he always did. You talked about your work honestly. You talked about why you came to Seattle. You ate dinner in your own kitchen with your parents, and you didn't perform any version of yourself for them. That wasn't fake, Vivian. She wanted to argue with that. She looked at the folded dish towel instead. Get some sleep, he said, not unkindly. 2 more days. He went down the hall. She heard his door close. She stood in the kitchen for another 5 minutes, and the city outside was dark and wet, and somewhere in the building someone was playing music low enough that she could only feel it rather than hear it. He looks at you the way I was never sure anyone was going to. She turned off the kitchen light. She didn't sleep well. Sien. Friday was supposed to be quieter. Her parents had meetings in the morning, Charles's actual business in the city, which had something to do with a construction materials company he was involved with, which meant there was a small and specific irony in the fact that Logan might theoretically have professional opinions about his suppliers. And Vivian had the morning to herself, which she used to do 2 hours of actual work and then spend 45 minutes staring at a blank email draft and ultimately not sending it. She went running at noon, later than usual, because the 5 a.m. rain had been the kind that felt personal. She ran the same route she always ran, down to Volunteer Park, around the reservoir, back up through the residential streets where the trees were bare now, and the wet leaves had plastered themselves to the sidewalk in dark mats. She ran until she stopped thinking about anything specific and started thinking about nothing, which was the entire point. She was back and showered by 2, eating toast at the kitchen counter, when her phone rang. It was her mother. We've decided to take you both to dinner tonight, Eleanor said, in the tone of someone who is framing a decision as an invitation. Mom, the restaurant has a private room. Your father wants to continue his conversation with Logan. A pause. He called him straight-talking this morning, which is the highest compliment your father gives anyone. He said that this morning? You've been discussing Logan since 8 a.m.? We discuss everything, Vivian. You know this. Another pause, softer. Come to dinner. Bring your quiet engineer. It'll be lovely. Lovely, in Eleanor Sterling's vocabulary, covered a wide range, anything from genuinely pleasant to a formal negotiation where the venue had better wine. Vivian had learned over 30 years to treat the word as directionally accurate but imprecise. I'll ask him, she said. He'll say yes. You don't know that. I know more than you think, her mother said, and hung up. She texted Logan, dinner tonight with my parents. You don't have to. They want the private room at Luca's. He replied 4 minutes later. What time? Not a question, just logistics. She stared at the text for a moment and then typed back, 7. I'll get someone to stay with Mia. He replied, she can stay with the Nguyen's next door. She's done it before. I'll sort it. And that was the end of that. She put her phone down and went back to work, and managed to actually work for 3 hours, which felt like a minor victory. She got dressed carefully for Luca's, more carefully than she'd gotten dressed for the apartment the night before. Not armor, exactly. She was past the phase of her life where she dressed for her parents' dinner tables as if preparing for combat, but deliberately. She wore a dress she'd had for 2 years, dark green, simple cut, the kind of thing that communicated effort without announcing it. She put on earrings. She didn't do the full makeup she'd have done in New York for an event, just enough to look like a version of herself that had slept, which she largely hadn't. She came out of her room at 6:20 and found Logan in the hallway, adjusting the collar of a dark blazer in the small mirror by the front door. He was wearing it over a gray shirt, dark pants, shoes that had clearly been cleaned recently. He looked like himself, but with slightly more structure to it, the way a building looked when its exterior had been considered. He glanced at her in the mirror. Green, he said. Is that bad? No. He turned back to his collar. It's good. It was the least romantic exchange imaginable, and for some reason she had to look away. Mia was in the living room, already in pajamas, because she'd apparently negotiated an early pajama situation with the promise of behaving for the Nguyens. She looked at her father and Vivian together in the hallway with the candid, unsentimental assessment of a child who had learned to read adults by watching her father navigate the world. "You both look the same, but different," she said. "That's a very accurate description," Vivian said. "Are you going somewhere fancy?" "Moderately fancy." Mia seemed to accept this as a satisfying answer. She held her arms up toward her father, who crouched down and let her wrap around his neck for a moment, her small chin on his shoulder. "Don't stay out too late," she said sternly, which was something Logan clearly said to her. He laughed. Not his small stovetop laugh, but a real one. "I'll do my best." Lucas had a private room in the back that felt like someone's idea of what intimacy should look like. Dark wood paneling, a circular table with a single low light above it, wine in proper glasses. Charles was already there when they arrived. He stood when Vivian came in, the automatic manners of his generation, and shook Logan's hand before he sat back down. Eleanor arrived 3 minutes later in black, and immediately took charge of the wine selection in the way she took charge of most things. Not aggressively, but with the casual certainty of someone who had never seriously entertained the possibility that the decision would be made by anyone else. The evening had a different quality than the night before. The apartment had been Vivian's territory, her kitchen table, her dishes drying in the rack. Luca's was neutral ground, and on neutral ground the dynamics shifted. Her father was more comfortable in restaurants than in other people's homes. He'd spent 40 years of business in restaurants, understood their grammar and their hierarchies, and Vivian watched him relax into the space in a way he hadn't fully done at the apartment. He and Logan talked about construction for a while. Real construction, material sourcing, engineering tolerances, the specific compromises that happened when cost intersected with structural integrity. Her father's company dealt in material supply on the commercial side, and Logan had opinions, and she watched the two of them talk about concrete compressive strength, with the focus of two people who had found an unexpected common language. Her mother talked to her. "You seem less anxious tonight," Eleanor said. "I'm exactly as anxious. I'm just better at managing it." "You get that from me." Eleanor said it matter-of-factly, without pride or apology. "Your father has never been anxious a day in his life. He has concerns, but they're always about external things. You and I carry it differently." Vivian turned her wine glass. "I didn't know you were anxious." "I've had 50 years to get good at it." Eleanor glanced at Logan and back. "He doesn't seem anxious at all." "He really isn't." "Does that bother you or help you?" Vivian thought about it genuinely. "Both," she said. "Depending on the day." Her mother smiled. Not the social smile, the one that lived in her eyes rather than her mouth. "That's how it's supposed to work." Across the table, Logan was saying something about cantilever design that her father was listening to with his full, sharp attention, and she watched them and thought, "This is the most real version of this fake thing I have ever experienced." And she didn't know what to do with that except drink her wine. What? They were on dessert. Her parents were. She was on a second glass of wine because she'd made a decision about the evening. When the door to the private room opened, the hostess said, "I'm so sorry that this room is reserved," but she was already talking to someone who was already coming in. Vivian's first impression was perfume, then heels, then the particular way some people move through a room, like the room had been arranged for their arrival. She turned. Standing in the doorway of the private room, in a cream coat that was almost certainly cashmere, was a woman who looked exactly as Vivian had always imagined she would. She was tall, brown-haired, with the specific quality of beauty that photographed extremely well, structured, deliberate, the kind of face that seemed to be always slightly in three-quarter profile even when it wasn't. She was holding a glass of white wine from the main bar, and she was looking at Logan with an expression that Vivian parsed in approximately 2 seconds. Not surprise. Recognition. The deliberate deployment of what she'd already known she would find. Logan had gone very still. "Logan," the woman said. Her voice was warm, practiced. "I thought that was you. What are the odds?" He didn't stand. He didn't smile. He said, "Cassandra," in a completely flat voice that contained approximately every piece of information Vivian needed. Cassandra Reeve was 34 years old, and she had dated Logan Hayes for 3 years, and she had ended it in a way that had Vivian had gathered this from 11 months of careful observation, from the particular silences and the way Logan sometimes looked at his own reflection in the kitchen window like he was checking to make sure he was still there, fundamentally restructured how he thought about himself. She hadn't gathered these details from Logan. He'd never told her any of this directly. She'd gathered it the way you gathered everything about a person you paid close attention to, incrementally, through small evidence, through what they didn't say. Cassandra looked around the table. She did it smoothly, her eyes moving from the Sterling parents to Vivian. And Vivian watched her face perform a small recalibration that lasted about a quarter of a second before the warm, social expression returned like a screensaver. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, in a voice that carried no actual apology. "I had a reservation in the main room. I didn't realize the back was being used." She looked at Vivian specifically, with the kind of direct attention that announced itself as evaluation. "I don't think we've met." "No," Vivian said. "We haven't." A moment. Charles Sterling, who had spent 4 decades in rooms where every word was a move, was watching this exchange with the contained interest of someone attending a match he hadn't been told about in advance. "Cassandra Reeve," the woman said, extending a hand across the table to Vivian. "Logan and I are old friends." Old friends was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and everyone at the table knew it. Vivian shook the hand. "Vivian," she said. Just her first name. She'd been doing that for months, and it had become habit, and tonight she was not going to change it. Cassandra held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. Then she turned to Logan. "You look well," she said. "You already said that," Logan replied, which was confusing until Vivian realized he meant it as a correction. That "you look well" was a phrase Cassandra used when she meant something else, and he'd registered it. "Did I?" Cassandra's smile didn't waver. She set her wine glass on the edge of the table without asking if this was acceptable. "I'm actually here with clients, architecture people, which is funny." She said it to the table, but the sentence was clearly aimed at Logan. "You're still at Meridian Structural?" "I am. I heard about the tower project. Impressive scope." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you still—" "I remember you always had trouble with deadlines on the bigger ones. The pressure would get to you." The table was quiet. Logan didn't answer immediately. He picked up his water glass, set it down. His face was doing the controlled, unreadable thing it did when he was choosing carefully. "I manage," he said. "Of course." Another smile. Then, back to Vivian. "Have you been in Seattle long?" "Almost a year," Vivian said. "What do you do?" And here was where it would have been easy. Easy and defensible, and in a certain light, even smart, to simply say publishing and leave it at that. To be plain and unremarkable in the face of a woman who was using her visibility to reduce the space available to everyone else in the room. But Vivian looked at Cassandra, and she thought about 11 months of sweatshirts and early mornings, and 5 a.m. runs, and a kitchen that smelled like ginger tea, and the specific quality of a man who never once asked her to be anything other than what she was. And she felt something clarify inside her. "I run a magazine," Vivian said. "I'm the editor-in-chief and primary owner of Meridian." It was the first time in 11 months she'd said it in this city. The private room was quiet. Cassandra's expression did something complicated, a small, involuntary reorientation, like a calculation that had just returned a different result than expected. She recovered quickly. She was good. But it had happened. Charles Sterling, across the table, looked at his daughter for a moment. Then he looked at Logan. Then he picked up his wine glass with the contained satisfaction of a man who had just watched something interesting occur and had decided not to comment on it. "Well," Cassandra said, and her voice was still warm, still composed. "How wonderful! I should get back to my clients." "Logan?" She looked at him. "It was good to see you. It really was." She meant it as something, and what she meant it as was, "I was here first. I know what you're like. I know every doubt you have about yourself because I put most of them there." Logan looked back at her with an expression Vivian had never seen on him before. Not the controlled blankness, but something under it, something harder and quieter. "Take care of yourself, Cassandra," he said. She picked up her wine glass. She left. The room exhaled. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Eleanor reached forward and refilled her own wine glass with the deliberate calm of a woman who understood when an intermission was over and the main performance had to continue. "Well," she said pleasantly, "shall we order the tiramisu?" And they ordered the tiramisu, and Charles asked Logan another question about cantilever tolerances, and on the surface the evening resumed. But under the surface, Vivienne was watching Logan's face, and she could see the particular tension in his jaw that wasn't there before. And she recognized it as someone working very hard to not be where Cassandra had just tried to send him, back inside whatever version of himself he'd had to rebuild after she left. Under the table, without thinking about it, Vivienne moved her hand across the seat and pressed her fingers briefly against the back of his hand. He didn't look at her, but after a second he turned his hand over. And they sat like that, loosely, quietly, not performing it for anyone, through the rest of the dessert course. The taxi home was quiet, the kind of quiet that's full of things rather than empty of them. The rain had come back, softer now, dragging down the windows of the cab, and the city slid past in streaks of reflected light. "She did that on purpose," Vivienne said. She wasn't asking. "Yes. She knew you'd be there." Logan was looking at the window. "Probably. Seattle's not a big city in the ways that matter. She could have found out. She came to see if you were the same." He was quiet for a moment. "That's what she does when she comes back. She's done this before." "Twice." He said it evenly, like reciting a measurement. "Once 6 months after. Once 14 months after. She always finds some reason. A scarf she left. A book she borrowed. Tonight was clients with an architecture connection." He turned from the window. "Each time she checks whether I've settled back into where she expects me to be." Which is where? He thought about it, not rushing to the answer the way people rush to answers that aren't fully formed. "Smaller than I was," he said. The taxi moved through a green light. Vivienne thought about the conversation she'd seen, the small cut of, "I remember you always had trouble with pressure." The way it was slipped in so casually, it almost didn't register as a wound until you found it later. "You weren't smaller," she said. "Not tonight." "Not any night I've seen." He looked at her. The cab light was poor, just the city coming through the windows, but his expression was unguarded in a way she only saw from him rarely. That specific openness that happened when something had cost him something, and he wasn't pretending otherwise. "When you said what you did," he said, "about the magazine. It needed to be said. You've been careful about that for a year." "I was careful for myself," Vivienne said. "Tonight I did it for different reasons." He was still looking at her. She made herself hold his gaze because looking away would have been the coward's option. And she was 30 years old and she was tired of choosing the coward's option with things that mattered. "She was trying to make you feel like something she'd already figured out," Vivienne said. "I didn't want her to get away with it." "You didn't have to do that." "I know. You could have just let it go and the evening would have been fine." "The evening was fine anyway." "Vivienne. Logan." She held his gaze. "I know I didn't have to. That's not actually the point." The cab pulled up to their building. The meter stopped. The driver said the fare, and Logan paid it, which he always did, which was one of those small habits she'd stopped trying to argue with 3 months ago. They got out into the rain. The apartment was quiet. Mia still at the Nguyen's, a light on low in the kitchen that Logan had left on because he always left a light on when he was out after dark. A small, careful habit. A man making sure his daughter, even asleep elsewhere, would come back to a lit apartment. Vivienne stood in the middle of the living room with her coat half off and thought about all the small, careful habits. The light, the note on the counter, the coffee before she woke up, the way he'd turned his hand over under the table. "I want to say something," she said. She had her back to him. She was still half in her coat. "Okay. And I need you to let me finish it." A pause. "All right." She turned around. He'd taken his blazer off, had it over one arm, was standing at the entrance to the hallway, and the way he stood when he was listening to something he took seriously. "I know what this weekend is," she said. "I know what we agreed. I know that Monday it's over and your parents never come back to check, and we go back to being roommates who share a kitchen and make each other coffee and don't ask questions." He was very still. But I think, she stopped, I think I've been pretending that this is all I want, that I came to Seattle to be invisible, and that being invisible was enough, and that all the routine, and the dinners, and Mia, and the kitchen at 1 in the morning, I've been telling myself that's just what happens when you share a space with someone for long enough. The apartment was silent except for the rain, and tonight I watched a woman try to make you feel like you were less than you are. And I introduced myself the way I actually am for the first time in 11 months. And I did it because of you, and I'm not, she pressed her hands together. I'm not going to pretend that means nothing. Logan set his blazer on the back of the chair. He came across the room, not quickly, not with any dramatic momentum, just the measured, deliberate movement of a person who had decided to close a distance. He stopped a few feet from her. Monday, he said slowly, we're not going back to being strangers in a kitchen. I know. That's my point. What I'm saying is, we were never that. We've been something else the whole time, and we both just pretended we hadn't noticed. He looked at her. Or you pretended. I'm not sure I was pretending. She felt her chest do something irregular. When did you... She started. I don't know. That's the honest answer. I don't have a specific date. He reached out, and for a moment she thought he was going to touch her face, and her whole nervous system braced for it, but he picked up a strand of her hair that had caught on her earring and freed it, and then his hand dropped. I know it was before I should have noticed. Logan, we don't have to do anything about it tonight, he said. I'm not trying to make tonight more than it already is. You said what you needed to say, and I'm telling you I heard it. That's enough for tonight. She looked at him. You're very calm, she said, which was what she'd said to him 2 nights ago at the kitchen table over the list of lies, and something in her chest turned over. I'm not calm, he said. I'm just not going to perform the part where I'm not calm. She exhaled. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to make tea, and went to the kitchen, and he went to his room for a few minutes, and when he came back out, she had 2 mugs on the counter, and the rain was still coming, and the kitchen smelled like ginger again, the same as it always did, except that something in the whole shape of the apartment felt different, not changed exactly, but finally named. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour. They talked about small things, Mia's volcano phase, a problem with the building's heating that the super kept promising to fix, a book he was reading that she had opinions about despite not having read it. Normal things. Unimportant things. The kind of things you talked about with someone you were going to keep. She didn't say that. He didn't say it. But it was there in the kitchen with them, patient and quiet, waiting to see if they were brave enough to let it stay. She went to bed at 2. At the door to her room, she stopped and looked back at him. Still at the table, glasses on, the folder of project papers open, the same amber light, the same pen in his hand. Logan, he looked up. Thank you, she said. For tonight. For all of it. He looked at her for a moment. Go to sleep, Vivian, he said. And the way he said her name, just her name, the whole thing, not shortened, not as punctuation, but as something held carefully, stayed with her until she closed her eyes. She slept better than she had in months. Saturday morning came in slow and gray, the way Seattle mornings came in November when the city had decided to take its time about waking up. The rain had stopped sometime in the night and left everything wet and still, the streets outside reflecting the flat white sky like standing water reflects clouds. Vivian woke at 6:43, which was late for her. She lay in bed for a moment, ceiling above her, and ran through the previous 2 days the way she sometimes ran through difficult documents, looking for the parts she'd misread, the implications she'd missed, the language that meant something other than what she'd thought in the moment. She found quite a few. She got up, put on her running clothes on autopilot, and came out to the kitchen. Logan was already at the table. Of course he was. But the folder wasn't open, and he wasn't working. He had his coffee, and he was just sitting, looking at the window, the way she sometimes stood in the kitchen at night looking at nothing in particular. She'd never seen him do that before. He heard her come out and looked over. Coffee's fresh, he said. The same thing he said every morning, same inflection, but there was something slightly more careful in it this morning. The way you speak to someone after you've both said something true out loud, and the morning is the first chance to see if the truth survives the night. She poured coffee and sat down across from him, not at the end where she usually sat, but at the adjacent corner, which was a small geographic choice that she was aware of making and chose to ignore thinking about. "How long have you been up?" she asked. 5. "You didn't sleep." "I slept, just not for long." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "My brain does that sometimes after days that have a lot in them." She thought about what that meant, thought about what the last 2 days had contained, and looked at her own coffee. "My parents want to do something today," she said. My mother texted. "She wants to take Mia somewhere. A museum," she said. Logan was quiet for a moment. "Your mother wants to take my 7-year-old to a museum." "She does." "Why?" Vivienne looked up. "Because my mother has decided she likes Mia, and my mother does not resist liking things when she's decided to like them. It's the rest of the time that's complicated." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but it's relative. "Is that a warning about your mother in general, or specifically regarding my daughter?" "Both, probably. But in this context, it means Mia will have an excellent time and come home knowing 3 new things about Northwest Coast indigenous art, and also having received at least one gift that is probably too expensive." Logan absorbed this. "And your father?" he asked. "My father wants to have coffee with you, alone." She watched his face. "He texted me this morning and asked if you'd meet him at the coffee shop on Pine Street at 9. The quiet stretched out for a moment. "He wants to talk to me without you in the room," Logan said. "Yes." "About what, specifically?" "He didn't say. He doesn't say things specifically in text. He says them specifically in person." Logan looked at the table for a moment, then back up at her. "And you want me to go?" "I want whatever you're comfortable with. He's not going to threaten you or make ultimatums. That's not how he operates. He's going to ask you questions, and he's going to listen to the answers, and he's going to form conclusions." She paused. "He already likes you. Last night made that clear. This is something else." "What is it?" She turned her coffee mug in her hands. "I think he wants to understand what this is, what we are, before they leave." "What are we?" The question landed cleanly on the table between them. He'd asked it the way he asked structural questions, not rhetorically, not to make a point, just because he wanted the accurate answer. She looked at him. Morning light, pale and diffused, came through the window and made him look like someone she'd been looking at for a long time. "I don't know," she said, "but I think it's something real." He held her gaze for a moment, then he picked up his coffee and said, "Tell him 9 works." He left at 8:40, coat on, keys in hand, and Mia watched him go from the couch with the focused scrutiny she applied to things she wasn't sure about. "Where's Papa going?" "To have coffee with my father," Vivienne said. She was sitting on the floor going through Mia's book bag, which Logan had asked her to check for the permission slip for the Monday library visit because he'd forgotten to look last night and she'd said she would. "Your father," Mia repeated, trying the idea on. "The one who was here last night. He's the only one I have." Mia considered this. He was quiet. "My father, he's not usually quiet. He was quiet at dinner, but he was listening loud." She said it with total confidence, as if this were a recognized quality. Vivienne stopped looking through the book bag and looked at her. "Papa does that too. When he wants to hear something really important, he doesn't talk." Vivienne thought about Charles Sterling the night before. The way he'd sat back during the Cassandra interruption and simply watched, the way he'd held Logan's answer to his question in a long silence before responding, listening loud. She thought that was probably the most accurate description of her father's conversational style she'd ever heard, and she'd had 30 years to develop one. "You're observant," she said to Mia. Mia shrugged, accepting this as fact. "Papa says it's because I read." "Your father is right about most things." Mia looked at her with those steady, dark eyes that were so entirely Logan's that sometimes it was startling. "Do you like my papa?" Vivienne found the permission slip in the outside pocket where it had been the whole time. She smoothed it out on her knee. "Yes," she said. "Like how?" "Like the way you like someone when they make everything feel more manageable." Mia thought about this for a long moment with the seriousness she gave philosophical questions. Then she said, "Okay," and went back to her volcano book, Apparently satisfied with the answer, and Vivian sat on the floor of the living room holding a permission slip and felt something enormous and quiet move through her chest. Eleanor arrived at 10 in her weekend version of herself, still put together because Eleanor Sterling wasn't capable of not being put together, but more relaxed about it, the cashmere coat traded for a good wool one, her hair down. She stood in the doorway and looked at the apartment in the daylight, and then looked at Vivian. "You're happy here," she said, not a question this time. Yes, I think so. You look like a person who has been living instead of performing for 9 months. It agrees with you." Eleanor came inside. She looked around the apartment with the eyes of someone who had spent a long time thinking about where her daughter actually was. "It's a real place," she said finally. "What does that mean?" "It means it has a crack in the kitchen wall and a child's drawings on the refrigerator and a bookshelf where someone actually reads the books. It means someone lives here." Eleanor looked at her. Both someones. Mia appeared from the hallway, already wearing her coat, which she'd put on before Eleanor arrived, apparently on the theory that being ready early was a form of persuasion. Eleanor looked at her, and her face did something that Vivian rarely saw, a softening, not the social warmth she deployed in public, but something older and less controlled. "You must be Mia," she said. "I know about volcanoes," Mia said, which was her current preferred introduction. "What a coincidence," Eleanor said, entirely seriously. "I've been wanting to learn about volcanoes." She held out her hand. "Shall we go?" Mia looked at her hand, then at Vivian, assessing. Then she took it. The door closed, and the apartment was empty except for Vivian and the rain that had started up again at the windows. And she stood in the middle of the living room thinking about her father and Logan at a coffee shop on Pine Street. And she was significantly more nervous than she'd expected to be about a conversation she wasn't even in. Logan got to the coffee shop 4 minutes early and ordered plain black coffee and sat at the corner table by the window the way his brain always selected corner tables by windows. The structural engineer's habit of understanding the room he was in. He'd been there for 2 minutes when Charles Sterling came through the door. Charles was in a coat that was well made without being demonstrative about it. He ordered at the counter and brought his coffee over and sat across from Logan without preamble, the way men of his particular type sat down, not settling in, just occupying. "Thank you for coming," Charles said. "Of course." A beat. Charles looked at his coffee, then at Logan. "I'm not going to pretend this is small talk. I didn't expect you to." "Good." Charles set down his mug. "I want to ask you about my daughter, not about the relationship. I have enough information about that. I want to ask you what you see when you look at her." Logan kept his hands easy on the table. "That's a specific question. I ask specific questions. It's a habit I developed when I found out that vague questions get vague answers, and vague answers are useless." Logan was quiet for a moment. He thought about how to answer it honestly and found that the honest answer was actually not complicated. "I see someone who is very good at being competent," he said, "and very tired of that being the main thing people see. I see someone who came to a city where nobody knew her name so she could find out whether she existed outside the name." He paused. "I think she found out she does." Charles was looking at him steadily. "You know who she is," he said. "The magazine, the name." "I've known for a while." "How long?" 6 months, maybe. I found out by accident. I didn't tell her." "Why not?" "Because she hadn't told me, which meant she wasn't ready, and it wasn't my information to surface on her behalf." Charles was quiet. He turned his mug. Outside, Pine Street moved past the window. Saturday morning foot traffic, people with umbrellas, a dog pulling its owner toward a particularly interesting lamppost. "My wife thinks Vivian has been in love with you for months and doesn't know it," Charles said. Logan absorbed this without showing much. "My wife is usually right about these things," Charles continued. "She was right about me, back when I was too busy being certain I had everything figured out to notice what was actually happening." He looked directly at Logan. "I was also a person who had rebuilt himself after something hard. Different circumstances. Same fundamental situation. A person who had decided to operate on a smaller scale because the larger scale had cost too much." Logan said nothing. But he was listening the way Mia had described, loud. "I'm not going to ask you about your intentions," Charles said. "I find that question insulting to ask and insulting to answer. What I want to ask you is this. He leaned forward slightly. She's going to be afraid. She's going to pull back and find reasons why this is complicated and create distance when it gets real, because she has spent her entire adult life in situations where being seen completely was a liability. When that happens, and it will happen, what are you going to do? The coffee shop was full of ordinary Saturday sounds. Someone's order number was called at the counter. A child at another table was negotiating loudly over a pastry. "I'm going to wait," Logan said, "not indefinitely, not passively, but I'm going to let her come to it the way she comes to everything, by working through it on her own terms until she trusts herself enough to say the thing out loud." Charles looked at him for a long time. "And if it takes longer than feels reasonable, I'll tell her that honestly. I don't do silent suffering." Logan picked up his mug. "I also don't think it's going to take that long. I think she already knows." A slow exhale from Charles. He leaned back. He looked out the window for a moment, and when he looked back at Logan, his expression had changed. Not softer exactly, but more settled, like a calculation that had finally resolved. "She called you kind," he said, "when she told her mother about you. That was the specific word she used." He paused. "In 30 years of watching my daughter evaluate people, I've never heard her use that word about someone she was seeing. She uses words like capable, interesting, grounded. Kind is the word she uses for people she actually trusts." Logan didn't say anything. "I just wanted you to know that," Charles said. He picked up his coffee and they sat in the corner table by the window and talked for another 20 minutes about the construction industry and the tower project and a materials supplier in Tacoma that Charles thought might be better than whoever Logan was currently using, and it was entirely ordinary conversation, and it was the most meaningful conversation Logan had had with a stranger in years. They all ended up back at the apartment at nearly the same time. Logan from Pine Street, Eleanor and Mia from the museum. Mia came through the door with the particular energy of a child who has been given a great deal of information she is very eager to redistribute, and she launched immediately into an account of everything she'd learned, which included 3 different indigenous weaving techniques, the geological history of the Pacific Northwest, and the fact that Eleanor had bought her a book about volcanoes that was, according to Mia, the best book that had ever existed. Eleanor stood in the doorway watching Mia explain everything to Logan with the expression Vivian had seen that morning, that soft, unguarded thing that Eleanor didn't often let out in public. "She's extraordinary," Eleanor said quietly to Vivian. "She is. She talks about you. At the museum." Eleanor kept her voice low, Mia still fully occupied. "She said you help her with her homework when her father is busy, and that you explained what engineering is in a way she understood. She said you taught her a word in French." "Tremblement de terre," Vivienne said. "Earthquake." She wanted to know the French word for things in geology. "Why French? I speak French. She asked me to teach her words." Vivienne watched Mia gesturing at her father, making what appeared to be an eruption motion with both hands. "I've been teaching her 1 a week for 2 months." Eleanor turned to look at her daughter. "Vivienne, don't. I'm not saying anything." "You're thinking loudly," Eleanor smiled. "I'm thinking that you've been building a life here and calling it hiding. There's a difference between those 2 things." She paused. "Your father liked him." "I know. More than liked. Your father doesn't have the coffee conversation with people he only likes. He has the coffee conversation with people he wants to understand." Vivienne looked at Logan across the room, who was now sitting on the floor with Mia's volcano book open between them while she pointed at a diagram with the focused urgency of someone presenting a thesis. "What did they talk about?" Vivienne asked. "I don't know exactly. Your father doesn't report. But he came back to the hotel to collect me and he was quiet." Eleanor glanced at her. The good quiet. The kind he gets when something has confirmed rather than surprised. Charles arrived 40 minutes later from the hotel, and they had lunch. Not a restaurant this time, just things Logan pulled together from the refrigerator with Mia's enthusiastic and partially counterproductive assistance. It was sandwiches and soup from a carton and sliced fruit, and it was entirely ordinary. And Vivienne sat at the kitchen table watching her father eat a turkey sandwich while explaining geotechnical analysis to a 7-year-old who was following along with alarming focus. And she felt something she didn't have a precise name for, something adjacent to wholeness, The feeling of a room containing everything it should contain. Her parents left at 4. The farewell at the door was different from arrivals. Her father shook Logan's hand and held it for a moment. Not long, just a beat past a standard handshake, the kind of beat that means, I see you clearly, and I'm not unhappy about it. Her mother hugged Vivian, and then, unexpectedly, hugged Logan too, brief and genuine, and then crouched down to say goodbye to Mia properly. Au revoir, Mia said to Eleanor with the careful pronunciation of someone deploying a word from a different language and wanting to get it exactly right. Eleanor looked delighted. Au revoir, ma chérie. The door closed. The three of them stood in the entry hall for a moment in the sudden quiet of a weekend that had contained more than a weekend usually held. Mia broke it first, naturally, by announcing that she was hungry again immediately, which was impossible, and retreating to the kitchen to investigate the situation. Logan and Vivian stood in the entry hall. Your father told me you described me as kind, Logan said, when you told your mother about me. She felt heat come up in her face, which was unusual enough that she noticed it distinctly. He told you that. He thought I should know. She looked at the floor briefly. I didn't think it would come back to me. Most true things do eventually. She looked up at him. He was a few feet away in the entry hall, coat still on because he hadn't taken it off when he came back, and his expression was the unguarded version she was starting to recognize as what he actually looked like when he stopped managing what he showed. I meant it, she said. It's the truest thing I've said about you. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I know, and went to take off his coat and check on Mia and the refrigerator situation, and it was such a simple response, and it contained so much that she stood in the entry hall alone for a moment, just breathing. Sunday arrived the way it had all been building to, which was to say, quietly, under the same gray Seattle sky, the city going about its slow weekend business as if the previous 3 days hadn't happened at all. Vivian woke at her normal time, ran her normal route, showered, made coffee. She was standing at the kitchen counter with her second mug when she heard Logan's door and then his footsteps, and she reached over and got another mug down from the cabinet. And by the time he came into the kitchen, it was already on the counter where he could find it. He saw it and stopped, just for a second. Then he came over and poured himself coffee, and they stood at the counter side by side, which they'd never done before. They usually oriented to different corners of the kitchen, his table, her counter, and neither of them moved to create more distance. Weekend's over, he said. Yes. Your parents are on a flight this morning. 8 o'clock. She'd gotten the text from her mother at 5:30. Boarding. Talk soon. Tell Logan the Tacoma supplier is called Hendrix Materials. The arrangement is officially concluded, Logan said. Officially. He looked at his coffee. That's not what this feels like. No, she said. It isn't. Outside, the rain started up again, tentative at first, and then committing to it the way Seattle rain always eventually committed. Mia was still asleep. Sunday was the one morning Logan didn't wake her, letting her body decide when it was done, which usually meant 9 or 9:30, and one remarkable occasion of 11:15 that he still talked about with awe. I want to ask you something, Logan said, and you can take as long as you need to answer it. Okay. Do you want to stay? The question was simple. It was also the most specific question she'd been asked in years, which was the reason it hit her the way it did, not in the vague, what are we, where is this going way of people navigating the early territories of something uncertain, but cleanly and directly. Do you want to stay? In this apartment, in this life, in this particular ordinary ongoing thing. She set her mug down on the counter. I've been trying to figure out how to leave for 3 months, she said. Not because I wanted to, because I thought I should. Because staying felt like admitting I'd started depending on something I didn't have a right to depend on. Why wouldn't you have the right? Because I didn't build it, honestly. I came here to disappear and I ended up... She stopped, started again. I ended up in someone's life, in your daughter's routine, in your kitchen at 1 a.m, and I didn't plan any of it, and I didn't ask permission, and at some point it stopped feeling like a temporary arrangement and started feeling like mine, like something I was allowed to have. Her voice had gone careful, the way voices went when they were carrying something fragile, and that scared me. Why? Because I've had things that felt like mine before, and they turned out to be things I'd constructed for other people's expectations. She looked at him. This doesn't feel like that. This feels like something that happened in spite of me. And things that happen in spite of me are things I don't know how to control. Logan was looking at her with that listening loud quality his daughter had named, like he was holding the whole thing carefully. I'm not something you need to control, he said. I know. And the apartment is already yours. Has been for 11 months. That's not something that needs to be renegotiated. He reached over and picked his mug back up, and the domesticity of the gesture in the middle of this conversation was so completely him that she almost smiled. What I'm asking is whether you want what this has been. Not what we pretended it was this weekend. What it actually was. The coffee in the morning and the Mia homework and the late nights and the kitchen at 1 a.m. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, I want all of it. Even the crack in the kitchen wall. Especially the crack in the kitchen wall. Something in him settled. Not dramatically. There was nothing dramatic about Logan Hayes when he was most certain. Just a small, complete arrival. Like a number coming out right after days of being wrong. He reached out and put his hand over hers on the counter. Not a gesture with a destination. Not pulling her closer. Not leaning in. Just his hand on hers, warm and real, and asking nothing more than that she let it be there. She turned her hand over. There's something I need to tell you, she said. Her voice was different now, lower and more careful, and more honest than she'd been ready to be 24 hours ago. About why I really left New York. Not the version I told my parents. You don't have to tell me tonight. I know. I want to. She looked at the window, at the rain doing its slow work on the glass. I had a relationship there. It ended 2 years before I came here. It ended because I looked up one day and realized I'd built the entire thing on who the other person needed me to be, and who I needed to be for the magazine, and who my parents needed me to be. And somewhere in the middle of all those layers, I couldn't find anything that was just me, just mine. She paused. And the terrifying part wasn't that the relationship ended. The terrifying part was that I couldn't even grieve it properly because I wasn't sure which version of me was doing the grieving. Logan was listening. Just listening. I came here to find out if there was a version of me that existed outside of all that context, she said. I paid 3 months' rent in cash to a man who didn't ask any questions, and I wore sweatshirts and ran at 5 in the morning and worked remotely, and I waited to see if I still existed. You do, he said. I know, I found out. She looked at him. Partly because of you. Not because you did anything specific. Just because you looked at me like I was a person already. Not like a name or a magazine or a problem to figure out. Like a person who was just there in your kitchen, existing. He squeezed her hand slightly. You were always just a person in my kitchen. I know, that's the thing. Her voice caught slightly, just at the edge, and she let it and didn't apologize for it. Nobody had ever made me feel that simple in my whole life. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I want to tell you something too. Okay. After Cassandra left, he said her name evenly. Just a word, just a reference point. I spent a year believing I was the problem. That I was too quiet, too internal, I kept a mental list of the things she said were wrong with me, and I kept running the numbers to see if they added up to someone who deserved to be left. And they always added up to yes, because that's what you do when someone you trusted tells you that you're insufficient. You believe it. He looked at the window. And then I had a life to keep going, and Mia needed me to keep going, and so I did. But I stopped. He paused. I stopped expecting that I was someone a person would choose deliberately. I thought maybe I was just someone people ended up with by accident, and then stayed out of inertia. She was completely still. You're not that, she said. You're the opposite of that. I know that now. Logan, what I mean is, he turned from the window and looked at her directly. You're the first person since all of that who made me feel like I was specifically worth choosing. Not by accident, not by proximity, specifically. His voice was very steady. Not because the thing he was saying wasn't real, but because he was himself, and himself meant carrying real things with steadiness. And I needed you to know that, not to make it pressure. Just because it's true and you should know the true thing. The kitchen was quiet except for the rain and Mia's distant sleeping breath somewhere down the hall and the small sounds of an apartment in the middle of a morning. Vivian looked at this man, this careful, specific, building things that don't fall down man, and thought about all the ways she'd spent 30 years being looked at and how different this was from all of them. How this was someone who had looked at the actual thing and not the surface of it, the whole time, without being asked to, without being told what he was looking at. She moved first. It wasn't a dramatic motion. She didn't close the distance like a scene while she leaned in and she pressed her forehead against his. Just that. Just the simple physical fact of it. Her eyes closed, and his hand was still over hers on the counter, and his other hand came up slowly and held the side of her face. They stayed like that for a moment. Then she turned her face slightly and kissed him. Soft and certain and real. The same words she hadn't known she'd been thinking since Friday night, when she'd watched her mother smile like she'd seen something arrive. No performance, no panic, no calculation. Just the honest conclusion of 11 months of mornings and coffee and kitchen table honesty. He kissed her back. And down the hall, from the back bedroom, they heard the particular sound of a 7-year-old beginning to stir, which meant the morning was about to reassert itself. The fox pajamas and the volcano questions and the cereal and the whole ordinary Sunday. And they pulled back from each other, and Logan's thumb was still light against her cheekbone, and they were both slightly wrecked in the way people were wrecked when something had finally resolved after a long time being uncertain. "Mia's waking up," he said. "I know. She's going to want eggs." "I'll make them," Vivian said. He looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face resolved into the expression she liked most on him, the one where the stovetop smile made it all the way to the surface. "You know she's going to ask you 17 questions about France while you make them," he said. "I know. I'm learning how to answer 17 questions about France." She stepped back toward the stove. "Go tell her it's Sunday, and she can take her time." He went down the hall. She heard him knock lightly on Mia's door and heard Mia's sleep-thick voice say something she couldn't make out, and she heard Logan's low response, and then Mia's laugh. That specific, genuine, unself-conscious laugh that she'd been hearing for months, and that she'd started to think of as a sound that meant everything was okay. She got the eggs out of the refrigerator. She didn't have a speech for what had changed this morning, and she didn't need one. Some things didn't announce themselves. They arrived the way water arrived when a dam finally stopped holding. Not with drama, but with the simple, unstoppable logic of things that had been true for a long time finding their way to where they needed to go. She cracked the first egg. She heard Mia's footsteps in the hall, the uneven, half-awake shuffle of a child who was not quite all the way in her body yet. "Bonjour," Mia said from the doorway. Vivian turned and looked at her. Fox pajamas, spectacular hair, the volcano book already in one hand despite the fact that she'd been asleep 40 seconds ago. "Bonjour," Vivian said. "Eggs?" Mia climbed onto the bar stool. "With cheese." "With cheese," Vivian confirmed. And the Sunday morning opened up around them, ordinary and irreplaceable, raining outside and warm inside, exactly as imperfect and exactly as sufficient as any real thing needed to be. The week after her parents left was the strangest week Vivian had spent in Seattle, which was saying something given that the previous week had contained a fake relationship, a surprise dinner ambush, and a kiss in her own kitchen on a Sunday morning that had rearranged the entire architecture of how she thought about her life. The strangeness of this new week was quieter. It didn't announce itself. It was just the ordinary texture of her days, except that now something had shifted in the way she and Logan moved through the apartment. Not dramatically, not in ways that Mia seemed to notice or comment on, but in the small calibrations that happened when two people who had been carefully maintaining a certain kind of distance stopped maintaining it. He still made coffee in the morning. She still poured hers without asking. But now sometimes they stood at the counter together instead of migrating to their separate corners. And sometimes one of them would say something inconsequential about the day ahead, and the other would respond, and it would be the kind of exchange that had no particular weight except for the fact that it was easy in a way that easy things rarely felt. Tuesday, she was on a call with her managing editor in New York. A long, complicated call about a feature piece that had gone sideways with its subject. And she came out of her room afterward with her hair in disarray from running her hands through it and found Logan at the kitchen table, not working, eating a late lunch and reading the newspaper, which was a physical newspaper because, of course, it was. "Bad call?" he said, not looking up. Moderately catastrophic. On a scale, a 4. Recoverable but irritating. She went to the refrigerator and stood in front of it, looking at its contents without really processing them. The subject of one of our feature pieces has decided they were misrepresented by a quote they approved in writing 6 weeks ago. Are they right? No, but being right isn't always the point. What is the point? She took out leftover soup and put it on the stove. The point is that people in uncomfortable positions look for the nearest exit, and the nearest exit is often the person who is holding the camera. She turned the burner on. I have to decide whether to negotiate or hold the line. What does holding the line get you? Editorial integrity and a very difficult subject. What does negotiating get you? A cooperative subject and a slightly compromised piece. He turned a page of his newspaper. What does your gut say? She looked at the soup. Hold the line. Then hold it. She turned around and looked at him. He was still reading, entirely calm, as if he hadn't just given her the clearest possible advice in the fewest possible words. You're good at that, she said. At what? Cutting to the thing. He looked up. You already knew the answer. You were just talking through why it was uncomfortable. Yes, but most people talk through it with me and end up where I started. You just went straight to where I needed to land. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd been cataloging for months, the one where something was happening behind his eyes that he wasn't broadcasting. Then he went back to his newspaper. Soup's going to boil over, he said. She turned around. It was. Wednesday, she worked late, which was normal, sitting at her desk until 11 with her laptop open and 3 windows running and the city dark and wet outside her window. She could hear Logan in the apartment, the specific soundtrack of his evening, which she knew by heart now, whether she'd intended to or not. The 9 o'clock news that he watched for exactly 20 minutes before turning it off. The running water. The quiet that meant he was reading. The light under his door. At 11:15, she heard a knock at her own door. She took her reading glasses off. Come in. He opened the door and leaned against the frame with the easy posture of someone who wasn't coming in, just checking. He had the end-of-day version of himself, the collared shirt untucked, the tiredness around his eyes that she'd learned to read as good tiredness, the kind that came from work rather than worry. You should stop, he said. In a bit. You've been in here since 2. It's a busy week. It's always a busy week. That's how magazines work. He looked at her desk, the papers, the 3 open windows on her laptop, the cold mug she'd forgotten about at 4. When did you last eat something real? She thought about it. Soup at 1. That was 10 hours ago. I had half a granola bar at 7. He looked at the ceiling briefly. Then, come out and eat something. I made chili. There's still some left. Logan, it takes 4 minutes. Then you can come back and work until midnight if you want. He pushed off the door frame. 4 minutes. She pulled her glasses off the top of her head where she'd pushed them, looked at the editorial calendar open on her screen, made a decision. Fine, she said. 4 minutes. She ate chili at the kitchen table while he sat across from her with his book, not making conversation, not creating the occasion of it, just being there the way he was there, which was to say, companionably and without demand. Outside it was raining again. In the morning she would remember this as one of the unremarkable evenings, except that she'd been sitting at her desk alone for 9 hours, and coming out to a lit kitchen and warm food, and a man reading across from her had felt like something she wanted to protect. She stayed 40 minutes. She didn't apologize for staying. Thursday was the day Cassandra came back. Vivian was out. She'd gone to a coffee meeting with a local freelance photographer whose work she'd been considering for a Meridian Spring feature, which had taken longer than expected and turned into lunch, which was a good outcome professionally and also meant she wasn't home when it happened. Logan told her that evening, flat and factual. She came to the apartment, he said. They were in the kitchen. He was at the stove and she'd just come in, still in her coat. He said it without turning around. She went still. What? Around 2 o'clock. She knocked. I answered. He stirred something on the stove. His back was to her, and she couldn't see his face. She had a scarf. A real one this time, I think. Gray wool. It looked like it could have been left here years ago, back when she used to come here. Cassandra was here, at this apartment. Yes. What did she want? He turned then. His expression was the controlled, unreadable version she'd learned to look underneath. The scarf was the stated reason. The real reason was she wanted to see the situation directly. She knew you'd been at Luca's with me. She knew about your parents. I think the Luca's thing bothered her more than she expected. What did you say to her? He leaned against the counter. I told her she could have the scarf. I got it from the closet. I'd found it 6 months ago, and I'd put it there, not knowing what to do with it. He paused. She tried to have a conversation about us, about what we were doing. She was careful about it. She's always careful. She said she was worried about me, and she wanted to make sure I was making clear-eyed decisions. Vivian's jaw tightened. She said that. Yes. Clear-eyed. Her implication being that I was making unclear-eyed ones. He said it evenly. She said she knew how I got with people who were kind to me, that I had a tendency to... He paused, choosing the word carefully. Conflate. To conflate gratitude and love. Yes, that was the suggestion. The kitchen was very still. And what did you say? Vivian asked. I said she'd come a long way for a scarf. A beat. And that the gratitude and love concern was an interesting thing to raise, coming from someone who had spent 3 years making sure I felt grateful just to be kept around. She looked at him. She left, he said. The conversation was about 4 minutes. Mia was at school, which I was glad about. He turned back to the stove. Vivian stood in the kitchen in her coat for a moment, feeling the particular heat of a rage that was mostly fear. Fear at what Cassandra had said, not because it was true, but because she recognized it as a version of what she'd been telling herself in the quiet, private minutes when doubt got in. That her being here was a form of dependence rather than choice. That Logan's steadiness with her was accommodation rather than feeling. That the whole thing was a kindness she'd mistaken for something more. She took off her coat. She hung it by the door. She went to the stove and stood next to him. He moved slightly to give her room, automatically, the way they moved to give each other room. I'm not conflating anything, she said. I know. I want to be clear that I know what this is. I know what I chose. She kept her voice level. And I know the difference between being kind to someone and choosing them. He looked at her sideways. I know that too. Then why are you telling me what she said? Why not just not tell me? He was quiet for a second, then, because you'd notice if I didn't, and because the things I don't tell you end up being the things that become problems. He looked back at the stove. I promised myself a long time ago that I wasn't going to be someone who managed information to control how a situation looked. Not with Mia, not with anyone who matters. She absorbed that. Okay, she said. Okay. For the record, she said, you told her the right thing. I know. He glanced at her with something that wasn't quite the stovetop smile, but was adjacent to it. I've been getting clear about what the right thing is. She bumped his shoulder with hers, lightly, briefly, and he let it happen, and they stood at the stove and finished making dinner. And Cassandra Reeve retreated back to wherever she went when she wasn't being a cautionary tale about what happened when someone believed they could own another person's self-perception. What happened over the following weeks was not a montage. Real life wasn't a montage, and Vivian had become allergic, in the particular way of people who'd spent their careers producing beautiful images, to anything that looked like one. What happened was ordinary and imperfect and sometimes frustrating and occasionally deeply good, and all of it accumulated the way real things accumulated, slowly, without announcement, one day at a time. She learned that Logan was bad at asking for help, not incapable. He was the most capable person she'd ever met at the physical and logistical business of living, but specifically bad at saying out loud when something was too much. She'd watch him take on more than was reasonable and manage it through sheer systematic effort, and it wasn't until she'd known him long enough that she could see the signs, a certain tightness in his face at the end of a long week. The way he'd go very quiet rather than ordinarily quiet when the Meridian Tower project hit a complicated phase, that she understood the pattern. She started doing small things when she noticed it. She'd take on the Mia logistics without being asked on the bad weeks. She'd make sure there was food that didn't require energy to obtain. She'd sit at the kitchen table when he was working late and just be there, the same way he'd been there for her, without making it a thing. And he noticed. She could tell he noticed because of the small, recalibrating exhale he'd do when he came into the kitchen and found these adjustments in place. Not relief exactly, more like the feeling of someone who has been carrying something slightly too heavy for slightly too long and has just had it lightened by someone who noticed without being told. "You don't have to do that," he said once. They were at the table past midnight. He'd been on the Meridian Tower structural problem for 3 weeks, and it had finally, that evening, resolved. She'd heard it in his voice when she passed through the kitchen at 11. A different quality of tiredness than the working through it kind. She'd made tea and brought both mugs. "I know," she said. "I mean," he rubbed his face. He was genuinely tired, the deep down kind. I don't need looking after." "I know you don't need it," she said. "I want to do it." He looked at her. "There's a difference," she said. He looked like he was processing that from somewhere specific, from the place in him where someone had once made him feel that needing things was a liability, that being cared for was a transaction he'd eventually failed to balance. She recognized the processing because she'd done her own version of it, and you could see it in people when they were dismantling something they'd built to protect themselves. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay," she said. She pushed his tea toward him and opened her laptop, and they sat at the table in the kitchen light past midnight, and outside the rain that was always either coming or going in Seattle was currently doing one of those things, and the apartment was quiet and warm, and the crack in the kitchen wall was still there above the light switch, where it had always been. Mia figured it out on a Tuesday in early December. She didn't make a production of it. This was entirely consistent with who she was. She was a child who gathered information patiently and then deployed it when she'd made up her mind about what it meant. She'd been watching them for weeks with those dark, assessing eyes, and then one Tuesday evening at dinner, without preamble, she looked at her father and said, "Are you and Vivian in love?" The kitchen table went very quiet. Logan put his fork down. He did it carefully, the way he did everything carefully when the thing in front of him required care. He looked at his daughter, who was looking at him with the calm, empirical patience of someone who had formed a hypothesis and was waiting for the data. "Why are you asking?" he said. Mia considered the question. "Because you look at her like she's the most important thing in the room, and she makes you tea when you're tired without you asking. And at school, Daniela's parents are in love, and they do that." She paused. "Also, you're different than before, in the way that's better." He was quiet for a moment. Vivienne was looking at her plate, and she was feeling approximately 17 things simultaneously, and she was making the deliberate choice not to be the one to answer this because this was between Logan and his daughter, and she would not preempt that. "Yes," Logan said. Mia looked satisfied. "I thought so." She picked her fork back up. "Can I still have ice cream after dinner?" A beat. "That's where you're going with this?" Logan said. "I've been saving it." She said it entirely seriously. "I thought if I asked the love thing first, the ice cream thing would feel smaller." Vivian, who had been holding herself very still, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else, but was somewhere in the vicinity of both. Logan looked at her, and the stovetop smile made it all the way to his eyes, and Mia watched both of them with the satisfaction of someone who had just successfully run a small social experiment. "Ice cream," Logan said, "is not a negotiating chip." "I know," Mia said. "But did it work?" A longer beat. "Yeah," Logan said. "It worked." December moved through the apartment the way December moved through Seattle, with an overcast sky that occasionally broke open to reveal something startling. A day of clear, cold blue that made the whole city look like it had been cleaned, and then back to gray. Vivienne put a small string of lights around the kitchen window, which was the entirety of her decorating instinct, and Logan and Mia put up a tree in the living room corner with the combination of precision and chaos that characterized all their joint projects. She'd been on the phone more with New York, not more than usual, just differently. The conversations had a different quality, because she'd made a decision she hadn't fully articulated yet, even to herself. And decisions that you haven't articulated yet had a way of leaking into the way you spoke about adjacent things. Her managing editor, Priya, had called on a Wednesday and said, "Are you moving the editorial base to Seattle?" Vivian had paused. "Why are you asking?" Because you've been directing the December issue from a different time zone, and it's working better than when you were in the building. And because there's a person in Seattle, and before you say anything, I'm not guessing, your mother told my mother at a benefit in October. Priya's voice was fond and direct, which was how Priya was about everything. I'm not asking you to announce anything. I'm asking if we should start planning for a distributed editorial model because the business works and it gives us better coverage of the West Coast market, and also you're happier. You can tell from bi-weekly calls. I can tell from the fact that you stopped rewriting my work. A pause. You rewrote everyone's work for 2 years. You stopped 6 months ago. Either you've gotten better at letting go, or you've gotten better at the things that make letting go possible. Vivian looked out the window of her room at the familiar Seattle street, the wet pavement, the bookshop across the street she'd been going to every 2 weeks since she arrived. Give me until January, she said. I'll have a proposal. Take the time, Priya said. The building will still be here, will you? I'll be here, Vivian said, but it might look different. She ended the call and sat in her room for a while thinking about what that meant, what it meant to build something real rather than to inhabit something already built. She'd inherited a magazine. She'd been handed an apartment in a city where someone else had established the rhythms before she arrived. Even the relationship, if she was honest about it, had come to her rather than being something she'd constructed. She'd simply been present for it, and it had grown around her. That wasn't a failure. She'd spent years telling herself that things that came to her by accident were less valid than things she'd chosen with intention, and she was learning to let go of that slowly, in the same way she was learning all the other things she'd needed to let go of. But she wanted, going forward, to choose deliberately, to build rather than only inhabit. She was working on what that looked like when Logan knocked on her door that evening. Come in. He leaned in the frame in his usual way. You okay? Yes, thinking. About what? She looked at him. About what I want to build. Something in his expression interested in this. For the magazine? For everything? He held her gaze. That sounds like a longer conversation. It is. I'll tell you about it this weekend. She looked back at her screen. What did you need? Mia wants to know if you want to watch the volcano documentary with us. It's an hour. She'll explain everything you need to know about the geology beforehand. Vivian closed her laptop. I'll be right there, she said. She told him on Saturday. They dropped Mia at a birthday party in the afternoon. A raucous affair at a gymnasium in Fremont that Logan had described as acoustically challenging. And they had 3 hours and they went to the coffee shop on Pike and got corner seats by the window, his preferred table, and drank their coffee and she talked. She told him about the call with Priya. She told him about the distributed model idea. She told him she wanted to formalize her life here, not just her presence in this apartment, but her professional presence in this city, the creation of a structure that said, this is where I am, rather than this is where I happen to be currently. He listened all the way through, which he always did, and then he said, what are you scared of? She hadn't expected that question, which meant it was the right question. That I'm choosing this because it's comfortable, she said. That I'm confusing happiness with safety. Are those different things? They should be, shouldn't they? Safety is what you settle for when you stop expecting more. He turned his coffee mug. Or safety is what you build when you found something worth maintaining. She looked at him. I don't think comfort is the enemy, he said. I think comfort is what happens when everything in a life is actually aligned. When your work and where you live and who you're with are all pointing in the same direction. He paused. Doesn't mean nothing will go wrong. Doesn't mean it'll be easy. Just means you stop wasting energy on things that are supposed to be right, but aren't. You make it sound simple. It's not simple. It's just not as complicated as we make it. He looked at her directly. Do you want to be here? Not out of comfort, not because it's the path of least resistance. Do you actually want to be here, in this city, in this life? She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. Then the rest is logistics. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to need a real desk. Not the one in my room. It's too small. He thought about it. There's room in the study. We'd have to share it. We share a kitchen. We can share a study. She looked out the window at the Pike Street Saturday crowd. People with umbrellas and coffee cups, a woman walking a very small dog with extreme dignity, a teenager on a skateboard navigating the wet pavement with more confidence than was strictly advisable. "I want to be clear about something," she said. "Okay, I'm not staying because of you." She looked back at him. "I mean, you're part of it, a large part of it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'm not rearranging my professional life to follow a relationship. I'm rearranging my professional life because my professional life can be run from here, and here is where I want to be, and those two things are related, but they're not the same thing." He nodded. "I understand that. I need you to actually understand it, not just accept it." "I understand it," he said. "You're building something that belongs to you, and the fact that it includes me doesn't mean it's defined by me." He held her gaze. "I'd be concerned if it was. I don't want to be the thing you built your life around. I want to be part of a life you built for yourself." She sat back in her chair. "How are you like this?" she said. "Like what?" "Like someone who says the exact right thing without trying to say the exact right thing." He shrugged. "Probably because I'm not trying." He picked up his coffee. "I've spent a lot of time around someone who was always trying. It seemed exhausting." She knew, without asking, who he meant. She thought about Cassandra, the way she'd moved through the private dining room at Luca's like she was always 3 moves ahead, always composing the image of herself she wanted the room to receive. It was exhausting. It was the thing Vivian had been afraid she herself was, before Seattle, before sweatshirts and 5 a.m. runs and a kitchen she didn't perform in. "I'm going to call my mother tonight," she said. "About the magazine? About everything. I owe her that." She paused. "She'll be pleased. She'll say she already knew," which she did. "Your father already knew too." "My father knew before anyone." She thought about the coffee shop on Pine Street, the conversation she'd been hearing about in fragments from both of them since. "What did he actually say to you that morning?" Logan was quiet for a second. "He said you'd be afraid when things got real," he said. "He said you'd pull back." He looked at her. "He asked me what I'd do when that happened. And you said you'd wait." "Yes. I didn't really pull back," she said. "No," the corner of his mouth. "You told me you wanted to stay before I asked you to. I didn't have to wait at all." She looked at him. "You're quietly very smug about that," she said. "A little," he admitted. She laughed. Not the social laugh, not the managed one, the real one, the one she'd rediscovered in the city, the one that came from somewhere that hadn't been available to her for a long time. He watched her laugh with the expression he had when something confirmed itself, and the coffee shop moved around them, ordinary Saturday afternoon, full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. They picked Mia up from the birthday party at 4:30. She was vibrating with sugar and social information and the details of a dispute about musical chairs that had apparently involved genuine controversy, and she talked from the car to the apartment to the kitchen in an unbroken stream that required nothing from them except proximity and occasional sounds of acknowledgement. Logan put dinner on. Vivienne helped, automatically, the comfortable choreography of 2 people who'd been navigating the same kitchen long enough to stop getting in each other's way. Mia was at the counter doing homework with her coat still on, which was a Mia thing. She could never quite be bothered to take her coat off when something more interesting was available. "Vivienne," Mia said, without looking up from her worksheet. "Yes? Are you going to live here forever?" The kitchen paused. Logan kept stirring what he was stirring, but she could see the slight shift in his shoulders. "I don't know about forever," Vivienne said, "but for a long time, I think." Mia wrote something on her worksheet. "Good," she said. "I've been teaching you French and I want to know if it's working." "Tremblement de terre," Vivienne said. "Éruption volcanique, lave." Mia looked up with an expression of pure, uncomplicated pleasure. "Good," she said again, with the satisfaction of a small person whose investment had paid a dividend. Logan put a dish on the counter without turning around, but she could see the back of his neck, and there was something in the set of it. Not quite the stovetop smile, but what happened to a person before the stovetop smile, the interior thing that preceded it. She reached past him for the salt and pressed her shoulder briefly against his back. He pressed back, just slightly, just enough. And outside, the December rain was doing its thing against the kitchen window, and the lights she'd strung were on, and the apartment was full of the particular warmth that wasn't temperature, but something that came from three people being in the same room and all of them wanting to be exactly where they were. Mia pulled her coat off finally, dropped it on the bar stool beside her, and went back to her worksheet. La montagne, she said to herself, trying out the word. Mountain. Exactement, Vivian said. What does that mean? Exactly. Mia nodded, filed it, moved on. The dinner finished and they ate, and the evening came in around them, and the city kept going in the dark outside. All its rain and its lights and its ordinary human business. And in the apartment on the third floor with the crack in the kitchen wall, everything was imperfect and specific and real. January came in cold and clear, which was unusual for Seattle, and felt, to Vivian, like the city making an effort. She submitted the distributed editorial model proposal to the Meridian Board on January 4th, a Tuesday, deliberately chosen because Tuesdays had no symbolic weight, and she didn't want this to feel like a statement. It was 42 pages, including the financial projections and the operational restructuring plan and a West Coast market analysis that Priya had helped her build over the preceding 3 weeks. It was the most thoroughly prepared professional document she'd produced in 2 years, which was saying something given that she produced thorough professional documents for a living. The board approved it in 12 days. She told Logan on a Thursday evening. He was at his drafting table. The Meridian Tower project had finally fully resolved in December, the load distribution problem corrected, the contractor notified, the professional credibility intact. And he was on something new, a smaller project, a residential build in Ballard that he'd taken because the family who commissioned it had a daughter with a mobility condition, and the father had come to him specifically because of his reputation for solving structural problems that other engineers had given up on. She knocked on the open door of the study. Her desk was there now, the larger one, wedged against the opposite wall from his drafting table, in a configuration that should have felt crowded and somehow didn't. And she said, "The board approved it." He set his pencil down and turned in his chair. "Full proposal?" he asked. "Full proposal. Distributed editorial model, Seattle as secondary base, West Coast Bureau formalized." She leaned against the doorframe. Priya gets expanded operational authority in New York, which she's wanted for 2 years and absolutely deserves. I get to run the thing from here without pretending I'm somewhere temporarily. He looked at her for a moment. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it genuinely, like I made a decision that was mine. A pause. That's rarer than it sounds. He stood up and he crossed the study, which wasn't very far because the study was not a large room, and he put his hands on either side of her face the way he had on that Sunday morning in November. And he kissed her in the doorway between the study and the hallway, which was not a romantic location by any standard definition, but which she would remember in precise detail for a long time afterward. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you." "You built that." "We built the conditions for it," she said. "You and Mia and this apartment and this city. I built the document." "Don't minimize the document," he said. 42 pages. You counted. "I proofread page 19 when you asked me to check the load-bearing analysis analogy you used in the market section." She had asked him that. At 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, slightly desperate, needing someone who actually understood structural engineering to confirm she wasn't using the metaphor incorrectly. He'd read it, made one small correction, and gone back to bed without making it a thing. "You're a good proofreader," she said. "Only for the engineering parts." He stepped back. "We should celebrate." "Mia will want to choose the restaurant." "Mia will choose the Italian place 3 blocks over, because she always chooses the Italian place 3 blocks over." "Is that a problem?" "Not even slightly," he said, and went to find his daughter. The Italian place had become, over the preceding months, something of a fixed point in their collective life. The restaurant they went to for ordinary occasions, and the restaurant they went to for significant ones, which meant it had accumulated a particular kind of weight that the people who ran it were entirely unaware of. The owner, a Sicilian man in his 60s named Marco, who had strong opinions about pasta water temperature and even stronger opinions about children who didn't finish their food, had adopted Mia as a kind of mascot over the course of numerous visits and always gave her a small dish of olives that she didn't eat but accepted with great seriousness. They ate, and Mia talked about a project she was doing at school about ecosystems. The volcano phase had expanded outward into general geological interest, which had expanded outward into environmental interest, which her teacher had described in a recent conference as the most comprehensive understanding of Pacific Northwest topography she'd seen in a second grader. And Logan and Vivian listened and asked questions and let the evening be ordinary in the way that ordinary evenings were the whole substance of a life. It was over dessert, tiramisu, which Mia had recently discovered and was now in a tiramisu phase that coexisted with the geology phase, that Vivian's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it. It was her mother. She picked it up. "I'll be 1 minute," she said to the table, and stepped toward the front of the restaurant where it was quieter. Eleanor didn't lead with small talk. She never did. "The board approved? News travels fast. Priya texted me." A pause. "I'm proud of you. For the proposal? For knowing what you wanted and building toward it instead of waiting for someone else to hand it to you." A beat that felt deliberate. "You've always been good at the work, Vivian. You weren't always good at knowing what the work was for." She stood near the front window of the restaurant, the street outside dark and cold, the lights of the Italian place warm behind her. She could see Logan at the table from here. He was listening to something Mia was saying about tiramisu, and his expression had the specific quality of a parent who is genuinely entertained by their child and isn't performing it. "I know what it's for now," she said. "I know you do. I can hear it." Her mother's voice had something in it that wasn't sentiment exactly. Eleanor Sterling didn't really do sentiment, but was its more functional cousin. Acknowledgement, recognition, the particular warmth of someone who had been watching for something for a long time and had finally seen it arrive. "How is Logan?" "He's across the restaurant listening to his daughter explain something about tiramisu." A small sound from Eleanor. "Your father calls him the honest engineer. Is that a compliment?" "From your father, it's the highest possible one." A pause. "He's asked about the tower project twice. I think he's following it professionally." Vivian watched Logan tilt his head at whatever Mia was saying and say something back that made her laugh. "Tell him the project came in correctly. The structural problem resolved. He'll want to hear it from Logan. They can talk. I'll tell Logan to call him." "Don't tell him. Let your father call him." Eleanor paused. Some things work better when they're allowed to find their own shape. Vivian looked at her reflection in the dark front window of the restaurant. 30 years old, in a blue sweater she'd had for years with the fraying on the cuff that she still hadn't repaired. In a city she'd come to in order to disappear and had somehow become visible in instead. She looked like herself. She looked like the person she'd been trying to locate for years. "Mom," she said. "Yes. Thank you for pushing. About the relationship. I know it felt intrusive at the time." A pause. "I was intrusive." "Yes, but you were also right. And I wouldn't have. The weekend with you and Dad here, the dinner, all of it, you would have gotten there," Eleanor said. "You've always been the kind of person who gets there eventually. I just accelerated the timeline." Another pause, softer. "I wanted to see you happy before I ran out of excuses to keep pushing." Vivian pressed her free hand flat against the cold glass of the window. "You didn't need an excuse. I know, but it's better when there's one." She could hear her mother's smile. "Go back to your dinner. Tell Mia her grandmother says hello. She'll want to tell you about tiramisu." "I hope she does. Good night, Vivian." "Good night, Mom." She went back to the table. Mia looked up immediately. "Who was that?" "My mother." Mia's eyes widened slightly. "Your mother who took me to the museum?" "The same one." "She says hello," Vivian said, sitting down. "And she wants to hear about tiramisu, apparently." Mia looked at her tiramisu, then at Vivian. Then, with the organized purposefulness of someone planning a communication, she said, "Can I call her?" Logan looked at Vivian over Mia's head. His expression contained approximately 7 things, and all of them were readable to her now. The contained amusement, the particular warmth that was Mia-specific, and underneath both of those, something steadier and more permanent that wasn't about the moment at all, but about the accumulation of moments, all of them, of stretching backward to the first rainy night at the kitchen table and forward into a future that neither of them could map, but both of them had stopped being afraid of. "I'll give you her number," Vivian said. "Tomorrow." Mia nodded. This was satisfactory. She returned to her tiramisu. February was when the work really started, not the professional work that had its own momentum now. The distributed model running smoothly, Vivian's weeks divided between her study in the apartment and a small rented office space in Capitol Hill, where she met with the West Coast writers and photographers she'd been quietly building a stable of. That was running. What started in February was the other work, the harder, less structured work of two people who had acknowledged what they were and were now figuring out what that meant in practice. It wasn't seamless. It was never going to be seamless. Vivian was a person who processed internally, and Logan was a person who processed by going quiet. And when both of those things happened simultaneously in the same apartment, they could go 2 days without saying the thing that needed to be said because each of them was waiting for the other to surface it. They'd been together properly, but she'd stopped using the word officially in her head because it felt like a corporate term for something that was nothing like corporate. For 3 months when they had their first real argument. Not a disagreement, not the gentle friction of two people with different organizational systems sharing a kitchen, but an actual argument with actual stakes. It was about the Ballard project. Logan had been working long hours on the residential build, longer than he should have, she thought, longer than the timeline warranted, and she'd said so on a Wednesday evening when Mia was asleep and they were in the study and he was still at his drafting table at 10:30. "You're going to burn out," she said. She hadn't planned to say it right then. It came out because she'd been watching it for 2 weeks, and it had accumulated past the point of sitting quietly. He didn't look up from his drawing. "I'm fine. Logan, the timeline is tight because the family has a specific window for the construction, and I committed to that window. I understand that. I'm saying the pace you're working at isn't sustainable. I've been doing this for 8 years. I know my own pace. You know your pace when it's just you and Mia and nobody in your life is paying attention to the signs." She heard her own voice and registered the edge in it. "I'm paying attention. You're tired in a way that's past tired." He put his pencil down, turned in his chair. His expression was closed in a way she'd learned to recognize as defensive rather than controlled. The subtle difference being that controlled was an active choice, and defensive was a response to something that had touched a nerve. "I don't need you to manage my workload," he said. "That's not what I'm doing." "It sounds like what you're doing. I'm telling you what I see. That's different from managing you." "Is it?" He said it without heat, which was somehow more cutting than if he'd said it with heat. "Because it feels like you've decided you have a better read on my limits than I do." She was quiet for a moment. She wanted to push back, and she also, underneath the wanting, recognized something true in what he'd said. She had been watching him the way you watched a project that was behind schedule, looking for the failure points. And there was a version of that came from care, and a version that came from control, and she wasn't entirely sure which version she'd been running. "You're right that it's not my call," she said. "What you do with your work is yours. But I'm not going to not tell you when I'm worried. That's not a condition I'm capable of." She looked at him directly. "If you want someone in your life who watches quietly and doesn't say anything, that's a different kind of relationship than what we have." He held her gaze. Something shifted in him, the defensive set of his jaw, slowly, almost invisibly. "What we have," he repeated. "Yes." A long pause. "I'm tired," he said. "Not as capitulation, just as fact." "I know. The family—" He stopped, rubbed his face. "The daughter. She's 8. Her name is Sophie. She uses a power wheelchair, and the current configuration of their house means she can't get into her own bedroom without assistance." He looked at his drawings. "I'm not going to cut corners on the timeline because I'm tired. She's been waiting for 2 years for someone to fix this." Vivian looked at him, this man who had taken on a project that wasn't prestigious or profitable because a child's bedroom was inaccessible, and felt the specific kind of love that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with character. The kind that came from seeing who someone was when nobody was offering them any reward for it. "Okay," she said. "Then let me help. You're not an engineer." "I know, but I can take everything else off your plate for the next 3 weeks. Mia's logistics, groceries, the building super who keeps leaving messages about the parking situation, all of it. So that when you're not at that table, you're actually resting instead of managing 12 other things." She paused. "That's not managing you. That's just being here." He looked at her for a long moment. I don't know how to let people do that, he said, quietly, with the particular honesty he had when something cost him something to say. I know, she said. I've been watching you not know how for 4 months. She kept her voice level and without judgment. You taught yourself to function without it. That was survival. This is different. His jaw worked slightly. It doesn't feel different. It feels like owing something. It's not a transaction. I know it's not. Knowing that and feeling it are... He stopped. Different, she finished. Yes. She got up from her desk and crossed the small study and sat on the edge of his drafting table, which was technically not the appropriate use of a drafting table, and she put her hand against the side of his face the same way he did for her, and she looked at him directly. You don't owe me anything for being cared about, she said. That's not how I work. That's not how this works. He put his hand over hers against his face. Cassandra made every good thing conditional, he said. It was the most directly he'd ever spoken about it. Every kindness had an invoice attached. I learned to refuse the kindness before the invoice arrived. I don't have invoices. I know. Do you actually know? Or does it feel like I probably have invoices and you're waiting to find out what they are? A long silence. The most honest kind. The second one, he said. Sometimes. She nodded. She didn't fix it. She couldn't fix it. That wasn't something that got fixed by the right sentence. That was something that got fixed by time and consistency, and every day she chose to show up without conditions. Then we keep going, she said. And every day it's not a transaction is a day it gets easier to believe it's not a transaction. He turned his face slightly and pressed his lips against her palm. Okay, he said. Okay, she said. She stayed in the study while he finished his work. She didn't talk, didn't interrupt. She brought her own laptop over and answered emails from her own end of the room, 2 people working in parallel in a small space, and it was the most ordinary thing, and it contained everything. Sophie's accessible bedroom was completed on schedule 3 weeks later. Logan came home that evening and didn't say much about it. He wasn't the kind of person who narrated his own good deeds, but he'd washed his hands at the sink and stood there for a moment with his hands still under the water, and Vivian had seen something in his face that was quieter than happiness and more lasting. She didn't ask. He turned off the tap and dried his hands. She cried, he said. Sophie, when she went in by herself for the first time. Vivian looked at him. Her parents cried too, he said. I didn't know what to do with that. I never do. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. You just have to let it land. He looked at her. Is that what you do? I'm learning to, she said. From you, mostly. The stovetop smile, the real one. March arrived and the city softened slightly at the edges. Not quite spring, but the suggestion of it. A day here and there where the sky went a different shade and something opened up in the air that hadn't been there in months. Vivian ran in the mornings, and sometimes Logan ran with her, which she hadn't expected and which Mia found deeply suspicious. You don't run, Mia said to her father one Saturday morning when they returned. I do now. Why? Because it's good for me. Mia looked between them with the expression she used when she suspected an incomplete explanation. Is it because of Vivian? Partly. What's the other part? The doctor told me my resting heart rate was higher than she'd like. Mia absorbed this. Is your heart okay? My heart is fine. He ruffled her hair, which she tolerated because it was early. Don't worry about my heart. She looked at Vivian. Is his heart okay? His heart is great, Vivian said. She caught Logan's expression and looked away before she laughed. They were good at that, at the small comedy of living together, the running jokes that didn't need explanation, the references that had accumulated over more than a year of shared space into a kind of private language that didn't exclude Mia, but that was theirs, in the particular way that things between 2 adults who had chosen each other were theirs. Vivian had not had that before. She'd had relationships that performed intimacy, the curated social media version of 2 people sharing a life. And she'd had the real version of aloneness, the 5 a.m. runs and the 3-month cash payments, and the careful management of what anyone knew about her. The middle thing, the actual dailiness of it, The running in jokes and the disagreements and the drafting table at 10:30 and the eggs with cheese on Sunday morning. This was new. This was what she hadn't known she'd been missing because she'd never had it to miss. It was a washing dishes night in late March when Vivian finally said the thing she'd been carrying since November. She'd been thinking about it for weeks, not rehearsing. She'd learned from bitter experience that she was bad at rehearsed conversations because her brain went off script the moment the actual human in front of her said something she hadn't anticipated. She'd just been aware of it, the way you were aware of a door you kept walking past, knowing that eventually you were going to have to open it. Logan was washing. She was drying. The rain was at the window. Mia was asleep. These conditions were so familiar that they'd become a kind of stage set. The specific Seattle rain, the specific amber kitchen light, the specific fact of the two of them at the sink, which was where, she thought, most of the true things in this apartment had been said. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Okay." She dried a plate, set it in the rack. "I was 27 when I took over the magazine. I'd been in training for it my entire life, not consciously, my parents weren't that calculated about it, but the whole shape of my upbringing pointed toward it. The best schools, the right internships, a specific kind of person developed to run a specific kind of institution." She picked up another plate. "And I was good at it. I am good at it. That's never been the question." "What's the question?" He handed her a glass. The question was whether the person doing it was real, whether there was anything underneath the training that was actually mine, whether I had preferences and opinions and desires that weren't just adaptations of what the institution needed from me. She dried the glass. "I didn't know. I genuinely didn't know." And not knowing that at 29 felt like the kind of failure that couldn't be named out loud because everyone around you is very confident that you're exactly who you're supposed to be. He was listening. She could tell by the way he'd slowed at the sink. "I came here to find out," she said. "I told myself it was a rest, a break, a change of scenery. Those things were true. But the real thing underneath them was, I needed to know if I existed as a person independent of everything that had been built around me." She set the glass down. "I exist," she said. "I know that now. I know what I actually like, and what I actually think, and what actually matters to me as opposed to what I'd performed for so long that I'd mistaken the performance for the content." She turned to look at him. "And a significant part of how I know that is you." He'd turned off the tap. He was facing her. "Not because you told me," she said, "not because you did anything specifically, but because you looked at me without all the context and you were interested in me, in the actual person in your kitchen in a sweatshirt at 6 in the morning. She felt her voice doing the careful thing again, the thing it did when she was close to something that mattered. "Do you know how long it's been since anyone was interested in the actual person instead of the context?" "How long?" "I don't know. Maybe never." She held his gaze. "And I know that's a big thing to say. I know it sounds like an overstatement, but I've spent 30 years in rooms full of people who were interested in what I represented, and you were the first person I can remember who was just curious about me, who asked what I thought and wanted the answer and not the position." He was very still. "I love you," she said. "I've known it for a while. I've been waiting until I could say it without it feeling like a response to circumstances. I wanted to say it on an ordinary night, doing ordinary things so we'd both know it was real and not just the feeling of relief that comes from things going well." The kitchen was completely quiet. Logan looked at her for a long moment. She watched something move through his face, not surprise, because she didn't think it was a surprise, but the particular kind of reckoning that happened when something you'd believed privately for a long time was said out loud by someone else, and the world reorganized slightly around it. "I know what you did," he said. "When Cassandra was at Luca's," she hadn't expected that. "What?" "You said your full name. You told her who you were." His voice was steady but not easy. "You'd been anonymous in this city for almost a year, and you said your name out loud in a room with my ex-girlfriend and your parents, and you did it because of me, because she was trying to reduce me, and you weren't going to let her." He paused. "Do you know what that cost you?" "It didn't cost me anything. It cost you the invisibility, the thing you came here for." She looked at him. "I stopped needing the invisibility. I stopped needing it the moment I realized I actually existed without it." She paused. "And yes, I did it because of you. I'd do it again. He reached out and pulled her in by the shoulder, not dramatically, just the straightforward physical fact of it, and she went without hesitation, her face against his shoulder, his arms around her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. I love you, he said, into her hair, quietly, like a man stating a thing he'd known for a long time and was finally saying in the right conditions. I have for a while, since before the weekend, since the morning I found you standing in the kitchen at 2 a.m. because your brain wouldn't stop, and I gave you tea, and you said thank you like nobody had ever just given you tea before. She pulled back enough to look at him. That was 8 months ago, she said. I know. You waited 8 months. You weren't ready, and I wasn't going to say it before you were ready. What if I'd never been ready? Then I'd have waited until I knew for certain and then told you honestly that I needed more than we had. He looked at her. I told you, I don't do silent suffering. She let out a breath that was close to a laugh. You were just silently in love for 8 months. That's different. Is it? Completely. The stovetop smile, fully deployed. Silent suffering is enduring something bad. Waiting for someone you love to be ready is something else entirely. She put her hand on his chest. I'm ready, she said. I know, he said. You've been ready for a while. I've been waiting for you to know it. She kissed him then, at the kitchen sink, with the rain at the window and the amber light overhead and the dishes half done in the rack, and it was nothing like the first kiss in November, which had been real, but also was still carrying the weight of everything they hadn't said yet. And it was nothing like the Sunday morning kiss, which had been the beginning of saying it. This one was different. This was after. This was the kind of kiss that happened when two people had gotten through enough of the hard parts to know they were going to keep getting through the hard parts. And that was worth something. That was worth quite a lot. They didn't fix the crack in the kitchen wall. Vivian had offered, in February, to call the super about it. Logan had said he'd handle it himself. March became April, and it was still there, above the light switch, the familiar thin line she'd been looking at since November of the previous year. She asked him about it one evening, genuinely curious. He looked at the crack, thought about it. I don't know, he said. I keep meaning to, and then I don't. Is it structural? No, it's purely cosmetic. The wall's fine. She looked at it. Does it bother you? Not really. She looked at it a while longer. Me neither, she said. Actually, she didn't know why it didn't bother her. She'd spent her professional life in beautifully maintained spaces, offices on the 42nd floor of midtown buildings, apartments that had been designed to a standard where no wall was allowed to develop opinions. The crack in this kitchen wall was objectively imperfect. It was also, by this point, as much a part of the room as the string of lights she'd put up in December and never taken down. A week later, she came home from the Capitol Hill office to find Mia standing on a chair in the kitchen, studying the crack with intense focus. I'm measuring it, Mia said. Why? Because I want to know if it's getting bigger. Your father said it's not structural. What does that mean? It means the wall is fine. It's just a surface thing. Mia stepped down from the chair. She looked at the crack, then at Vivian. I like it, she said. Why? She considered it with her usual seriousness. Because it looks like a story, she said, like the wall had something happen to it and it kept the mark. She cocked her head. Walls in new buildings don't have marks like that. Vivian looked at the crack. No, she said. They don't. Logan was in the study when she went to tell him this. He was at his drafting table on the Ballard follow-up, a small modification the family had requested after moving back in, and he looked up when she came in. She leaned in the doorway. Your daughter said the crack looks like a story, she said. He set his pencil down slowly. Yeah, he said. She said new walls don't have marks like that. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the ceiling in the particular way he looked at things that had just confirmed something he'd suspected. I'm not fixing it, he said. I know, she said. I don't want you to, Mom. It was a Saturday in April, a good one, the clear, cold blue kind that appeared occasionally in Seattle and made you feel the preceding weeks of rain had been worth it. When Vivian sat at her desk in the study and wrote her mother an email that was not about work, She wasn't usually an email person for personal things, but she wanted to write it rather than say it. She wanted to choose the words with the same care she'd been learning to bring to the other choices. The deliberate ones, the ones that said, "This is mine," rather than "This is what's available." She wrote about the proposal, which her mother already knew about. She wrote about the West Coast Bureau, which her mother had heard the broad strokes of. And then she wrote the other part. "I want to tell you something about the apartment, not the professional situation. You know that. The other thing. I've been trying to figure out for months how to explain what it's like to live here. I keep reaching for the big words and they keep being wrong, too large, too round, too final. What it actually is small. It's very small and very specific. It's a 7-year-old who puts her coat on before she's ready to leave because she's optimistic about the timing. It's a man who reads physical newspapers and tips 25% and leaves a light on when he goes out at night. It's a kitchen that smells like ginger tea and a crack in the wall above the light switch that neither of us has fixed and neither of us wants to. I think what I've learned, what this year has actually been teaching me, underneath everything I thought it was teaching me, is that the right things don't always arrive with ceremony. Most of the time they arrive at 6 in the morning when you're not looking, in the form of a cup of coffee that someone made before you asked. I'm happy, Mom. Not the performance of happy that I've had access to my whole life. The actual thing. I wanted you to know that because you pushed when I didn't know what I needed and you were right to push, and I know I wasn't gracious about it at the time. I'll call you Sunday. Mia wants to talk about tiramisu. She read it once, sent it without revising. She got up from her desk and went to the kitchen, where Mia was doing something involved with construction paper and safety scissors on the kitchen table. And Logan was making coffee, and the April light was coming through the kitchen window at the particular angle that meant it was mid-morning and the day had a long open run ahead of it. She poured herself coffee without asking. Logan glanced at her sideways. "Good morning," he said, even though it was 10:30. "Good morning," she said. She sat down at the kitchen table near Mia, who was cutting something in the shape of a volcano, and she put her hands around her mug and looked at the kitchen. The string of lights she'd never taken down, the crack above the light switch, the refrigerator with Mia's drawings held on with mismatched magnets, the counter with the ring stain from a coffee mug that neither of them had thought to clean because it had simply become part of the counter. And she thought about her mother's voice in the restaurant doorway. "He looks at you the way I was never sure anyone was going to." She'd spent 30 years believing that love was something you proved yourself into, that you demonstrated your value and your worth and your competence until someone decided you were sufficient, that the right relationship was the one where you were performing well enough that nobody noticed the performing. What she'd found in this apartment, on this street, in this rain-soaked city she'd chosen by accident and kept by choice, was something so much simpler and so much harder that she still sometimes couldn't fully look at it directly. She'd found someone who saw the actual person and not the surface of the person, and who chose the actual person deliberately, and who didn't need her to be anything other than what she was on a Tuesday morning in a sweatshirt making eggs with cheese. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was inconvenient and occasionally frustrating and imperfect in the specific ways that anything real was imperfect. Two people with histories and damage and deeply established habits sharing a space and a life and a 7-year-old's extremely comprehensive geological education. There were mornings when they moved around each other in silence that wasn't comfortable but tired. There were evenings when Vivian's brain wouldn't stop and Logan's patience had a limit after all, and neither of them was at their best. There were ongoing negotiations about which of them left cabinet doors open, her, consistently, unapologetically, and which of them was incapable of replacing an empty toilet paper roll with anything resembling urgency. Him, bafflingly, given how organized he was about everything else. None of that canceled the other thing. The other thing was bigger than all of it, and quieter than all of it, and had arrived, she understood now, not in a moment or a weekend or a single conversation at a kitchen table in November, but incrementally, the way all the things that actually lasted arrived. Through accumulation and attention, and the repeated daily choice to show up, even on the days when showing up was less about grand feeling and more about just being there. She watched Logan pour his coffee and come to the table and sit across from her and open the newspaper that was somehow always there. And she watched Mia make a volcano that was honestly quite recognizable as a volcano. "La lave," Mia said to herself, writing something on the volcano in marker. "La lave," Vivian confirmed. Logan looked at her over the newspaper. That look. She looked back. Outside, Seattle was doing its April thing. The sky a particular clear blue, the streets still wet from the previous day's rain, the trees along the block beginning to figure out that it was almost spring. The city went on in its ordinary way, full of ordinary people doing ordinary things, and in the apartment on the third floor, with the crack in the kitchen wall and the lights that never came down, and a newspaper and a volcano made of construction paper, 3 people had breakfast. It was not remarkable. It was, for every one of them, exactly enough.